She was 22 and broke. No house, no savings, no living kin willing to claim her. Just a dented blue pickup and $7 she had kept folded inside her mother's black church glove after the funeral. And with that $7, she bought a ruined water-powered grist mill sagging beside Walden Creek near Pigeon Forge, Sevier County, Tennessee, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1979. The wheel hung crooked, half sunk in mud. The roof had opened along the ridge like a split lip. The county had condemned it since 1983 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the hollow heart of the upper Millstone, in a sealed copper compartment that had not been opened in over 80 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Silas Mae Whitaker had been losing her whole life without knowing it. Not the dramatic kind of losing that people remember and speak of in clean sentences later. Hers had been quieter than that. Patient as rain working at a roof nail, careful as frost finding the seam in a jar. It had begun in a white farmhouse outside Maryville where the porch boards were painted every other summer and the pasture grass came up soft around the fence posts. It had begun with ordinary things left unfixed because there was never enough money for them, and with a child learning early not to ask for what could not be given. She was a narrow-shouldered girl then, brown-haired, solemn-eyed, made of elbows and listening. She learned the weather by smell before she learned it from any radio. A metallic scent meant a hard rain coming off the mountains. A sweet, bruised smell meant the apples were down in the orchard and yellow jackets were working the splits. When the creek behind the lower field ran the color of weak coffee, her father would stand at the kitchen window and say nothing, because he knew the fence would be down again by morning. The Whitaker place had never been prosperous, but it had once been exact. Gate latches closed. Axe handles were hung in pairs. Quilts were folded square at the foot of beds. Her mother, Ruth, kept a ledger in the cabinet above the flour tin, writing grocery amounts in a script so even and slanted it seemed less like handwriting than a path through snow. Her father, Daniel, could set a step level by eye, then check it with a mason's spirit level only because honest work deserved witnesses. Silas grew up beside work. That was different from growing up beneath hardship, though the two were often mistaken for each other. Work had rhythm. Hardship had appetite. Work had an end to the day, even if only the end of light. Hardship sat down at the supper table and waited for the plates to be scraped clean. Her father died when she was 13, not in a storm or a field accident, but from a blood clot that reached his lungs while he was putting on his boots one October morning. Silas remembered the ordinary cruelty of it. One boot on, one boot beside the chair, coffee still warming on the stove. Her mother standing at the bedroom doorway with one hand against the frame, looking not at Daniel but at the unfinished motion of him. After that, the house became a place of lowered voices. Ruth did not collapse. She did not wail. She did what women in that valley had always done when grief came into the kitchen before breakfast. She washed cups. She found papers. She answered men who removed their hats at the door and spoke as if money were something grief could be trained to understand. At night, when she thought Silas was asleep, she sat at the table and pressed her fingers into her temples. The ledger opened before her, the numbers patient and cold. It was during those years that Silas began spending Saturdays with Asa Whitaker. He was her father's uncle, though everyone in Blount and Sevier County seemed to claim him by some other relation. Cousin, neighbor, old friend, last good man who knew how things were once done. He lived in a two-room cabin above Wares Valley Road, where smoke came out of a stone chimney he had laid himself in 1956, and where the walls smelled of cedar shavings, lamp oil, and coffee boiled until it surrendered. Asa was a carpenter when boards needed joining, a stone carver when rock needed persuading, and a millwright whenever someone still cared enough to ask how water had once been made to work without being owned by a company. He had hands that seemed too large for fine labor, until Silas watched him sharpen a chisel on a waterstone with strokes so exact they looked like prayer. Every Saturday, Ruth drove Silas as far as the gravel turnoff, and Asa came down the lane in a faded canvas coat with a hickory cane he did not need. He would tip his hat to Ruth, never speaking too much to her because he knew sorrow could be made heavier by kindness offered in the wrong measure. Then he and Silas would climb to the cabin together, and the weekend ritual would begin. First, coffee for him and chicory milk for her. Then he swept the shop floor, though it was already swept, and made her sweep it again. Not because dust mattered more than work, but because he believed a person could not begin by standing among yesterday's carelessness. After that came tools. He taught her the names before he let her touch them. Slick, froe, mallet, mortise gauge, plumb bob, rip saw, jack plane, cold chisel, pitching tool, tooth chisel, point. He made her say each one and hold it correctly. A tool held wrong, he said, would lie to the hand. A tool held right would tell the truth even when the worker did not want to hear it. By 14, Silas could sharpen a plane iron, square a board end, and read grain like weather. By 15, she could carve a shallow line into limestone without bruising the edge. By 16, she knew how to set wedges into a drilled stone and listen for the first honest click of separation. Asa did not praise her in the way schoolteachers did, with bright words and a hand on the shoulder. He nodded once. That was plenty. His nod was a door opening. On wet Saturdays, when the roof tapped and the woods steamed, he told her about mills that had lined the creeks before asphalt roads and tourist cabins came pushing through the valleys. Corn went in as a farmer's hard year. Meal came out warm and fragrant, ready for pone, mush, spoon bread, and winter keeping. A miller knew every family not by gossip but by grain. Who brought good corn? Who stretched a sack with chaff? Who could pay? Who could not? Water remembers the shape of work, Asa told her once, while they stood beside a broken raceway near Townsend, measuring a rotted sill beam no one planned to save. He said it without importance, as if he were naming the weather. For years, Silas carried the sentence without understanding it. Later she would know he had not meant that water had a mind, or that labor was holy just because it was difficult. He meant that honest work leaves a form behind it, a groove, a hollow, a sound that remains possible long after the hand is gone. When Asa died, Silas was 19. He had been splitting kindling beside the cabin and had stacked half a cord so neatly that the sheriff's deputy who found him said it looked as though he had only stepped away to wash for supper. His cane leaned against the chopping block. His cap rested on the woodpile. The maul lay with its head half buried in a round of locust, the handle angled upward toward the bare November trees. The funeral was held at a Baptist church with green carpet and varnished pews. Men who had not visited Asa in 10 years came and spoke of him as if regret were a form of respect. Women brought casseroles and covered dishes and asked Silas if she was doing all right, which gave her nothing useful to answer. Ruth wore navy and kept her gloves folded in her lap. Mallory-Whitaker stood near the back, taller than the other men, smelling faintly of expensive soap and wintergreen. Nolan was Silas's half-brother. though the word brother had never settled comfortably between them. He had been born to Daniel's first wife and had already left home before Silas could remember his presence as more than framed photographs and tense Christmas meals. He worked in Knoxville by then, in an office that handled land transfers, liens, state disputes, and small legal miseries too narrow for courtrooms but wide enough to swallow families. After Ace's burial, Silas went up to the cabin for the tools. She found the shop swept bare. The rack where the planes had hung was empty except for pale rectangles on the wall. The chisels were gone. The wooden mallet, worn glossy at the handle by Ace's thumb, was gone. The shoebox of quarry feathers and wedges had vanished from beneath the bench. Even the water stones had been taken, leaving damp outlines on the shelf. Only one thing remained. A bent nail lay on the floor near the stove, as if it had fallen from someone's pocket and been judged not worth stealing. Silas picked it up and held it in her palm. It was blackened at one end, hand-cut, older than she was by a long measure. She put it in the coin pocket of her jeans and never spent the grief of it on words. Nolan did not mention the tools. He only said the estate was complicated. He said Asa had debts. He said the cabin sat on land with unclear access and timber rights. He said everything in the shop had been inventoried, though he never produced the paper, and Ruth did not ask him to. That was how Nolan moved through life. Not violently, not loudly. He arrived with envelopes, with signatures marked in yellow, with a voice that seemed reasonable because it had no weather in it. He wore pressed shirts even on Saturdays and kept his fingernails trimmed close. When he smiled, only one side of his face agreed to it. Silas tried working after that. She stocked shelves at a farm supply store, cleaned rooms at a motel near Alcoa Highway, and took 2 semesters at community college before the tuition bill and her mother's prescriptions made a private arithmetic of quitting. At night she came home and repaired what she could. A cabinet hinge, a porch step, a cracked windowsill. Ruth watched her sometimes from the kitchen chair, her face thinned by illness and worry, and there were evenings when she almost spoke. Then came Ruth's final spring. There was no clean way to tell that part. Her mother's body became a room the doctors kept closing. First one hallway, then another. Silas drove her to appointments in the blue pickup with the passenger window taped at the top and a towel folded under Ruth's elbow. They crossed Maryville, Knoxville, and back again through rain, heat, and pollen. Ruth kept her black church gloves in her purse even when she no longer had strength to attend service. She died in late May, after 3 days of not waking fully. The funeral was smaller than Asa's. Fewer casseroles. More unpaid bills. Nolan came in a gray suit and stood beside Silas at the graveside, close enough to appear faithful from a distance. When the preacher finished, he placed one hand on Ruth's coffin, then removed it before the gesture could cost him anything. 2 days later, he came to the farmhouse with a folder. The house had been washed in evening light. Dust floated in the parlor where Ruth's chair sat angled toward the window. Silas had been sorting medicine bottles into a paper sack, keeping the labels turned away from her because the names looked too intimate now. Nolan set the folder on the kitchen table. Beside it he placed Daniel's brass plumb bob, the one Silas had thought lost in Asa's shop years before. She looked at it before she looked at him. The plumb bob was worn smooth at the tip. Its line had been wound around the brass body with care, the knot tucked under itself. Her father had used it to hang doors, set posts, and teach her that gravity was a stricter judge than any man. Seeing it on Nolan's side of the table made the room go cold in a way the weather could not explain. He opened the folder. There were forms inside, the kind with small print and blank lines where names became decisions. He explained that the farm had debts against it. He explained that Ruth had signed certain agreements during her illness. He explained that Silas could either contest the matter and lose everything in fees, or she could sign a release and walk away clean. Clean. That was the word he used. Ruth was in the next room by then only as ashes in a temporary box from the funeral home, because Silas had not yet found the courage to bury her beside Daniel. Her black gloves lay folded on the table, the left one slightly open at the wrist. Silas saw the corner of a paper beneath them. Her mother's handwriting. Her mother's consent. Not forced. Not forged. A signature written with a trembling hand, but still written. Silas waited for something in the room to defend her. The refrigerator hummed. A fly touched the window glass. The plumb bob lay between them, exact and silent. Nolan slid a pen across the table. "Sign it, Silas. There is nothing left here." 8 words. Silas looked toward the parlor, toward the chair where Ruth had spent her last months watching light move across the wall. She understood then that betrayal did not always come with malice. Sometimes it came with exhaustion. Sometimes it wore a mother's hand and believed itself practical. Ruth had signed away what she could not bear to fight over, and in doing so had left her daughter no ground to stand on. Silas signed. She did not cry at the table. She did not accuse him. She did not ask for the tools, or the field, or the cedar chest at the foot of Ruth's bed. She took the black gloves, the paper sack of medicine bottles, the plumb bob when Nolan looked toward the window, and the keys to her truck. By the following morning, the locks had been changed. For 6 weeks, she lived by the slow subtraction of money. At first she stayed in Maryville, parking behind a closed laundromat because the security light reached the cab but not the bed of the truck. She slept sitting up with a coat rolled behind her neck and Ruth's gloves tucked in the glove compartment, where the $7 stayed folded inside the left palm. The June heat made the vinyl seats sticky. Mosquitoes came through the torn weather stripping. Every sound became a question she did not want answered. She bought peanut butter, crackers, and a gallon jug of water. She washed in the restroom at Sandy Springs Park before families arrived with coolers and towels. She kept a comb, toothbrush, and bar of soap in a freezer bag. By the end of the first week, she had counted her cash so often that the bills felt thin from being handled. Then she drove to Knoxville because cities were better at hiding people. She parked one night beneath an overpass near the edge of town, but the traffic never stopped trembling above her, and at 2 a.m. a man knocked on the passenger window and asked if she had a lighter. She shook her head without moving her hands from the steering wheel. After that she slept in a hospital parking lot for 3 nights, moving the truck between rows at dawn, carrying a paper cup from the lobby so she looked as if she belonged to someone inside. She applied for work at a grocery store, a diner, a warehouse, and a motel with carpet that smelled of old rain. Each place asked for an address. She wrote the farmhouse address twice before learning to leave the line blank and say she was between places. The words sounded temporary. That was their only mercy. By the 3rd week, her money had fallen to $43 and some coins. She sold her mother's watch at a pawn shop on Chapman Highway. The man behind the counter turned it over with a jeweler's loop, named a price without lifting his eyes, and slid the cash toward her through a half-moon cut in the glass. Silas almost told him it had been Ruth's wedding gift. She almost told him Daniel had saved for it through 2 winters. Instead she nodded, took the bills, and left before the bell above the door finished ringing. In Sevierville, she tried sleeping behind a strip mall where a thrift store left broken furniture near the dumpster. The smell was sour. The pavement held the day's heat until nearly midnight. She lay across the truck seat and listened to tourists laughing as they came out of a pancake house across the road, their voices softened by fullness and vacation. She did not hate them. That would have taken more strength than she had. One Sunday she drove into Pigeon Forge because gas was lower there and because the mountains, visible beyond the signs and traffic, still looked like a thing that could keep a secret. The town was crowded with families, buses, bright storefronts, miniature golf courses, souvenir shops, and breakfast places with long porches. Silas moved among them like a person behind glass. She used the restroom at a gas station, bought a banana with coins, and sat in the truck bed behind a discount store while rain came down hard enough to make the asphalt smoke. The truck had been her father's once, then Ruth's, then no one's in particular. Its blue paint was faded to the color of a winter shirt. The driver's door bore a long dent from a gatepost Silas had struck at 17. One mirror was held with black tape. The bench seat had split along the seam, exposing yellow foam that crumbled when touched. Still, it started most mornings after 3 patient turns of the key. By the 5th week, she had $21. By the 6th, she had 13, and she stopped buying anything that required a clerk to look at her closely. The public library in Sevierville became her shelter during daylight. It had cold air, clean tables, and chairs no one asked her to leave unless she slept to, obviously. She read repair manuals because reading novels made hunger worse. Roofing, wiring, masonry, plumbing, small engine maintenance. She copied diagrams into a spiral notebook salvaged from a school supply bin, not because she had any place to repair, but because instruction was steadier than memory. On a Wednesday afternoon, while thunder pressed low against the windows, she found the classified ad. It was not in the main newspaper. It had been pinned to a corkboard near the copy machine, half covered by a flyer for piano lessons and another for a church rummage sale. The paper was yellowed at the corners, though the date stamped at the bottom was current. Someone had typed it on a machine with a weak letter E. Sankaty Auction Orator. Derelict Mill Construct. Walden Creek Road Area. Assis. No utilities. No access. Minimum. Buyer assumes all Cyclop. Demolition pending. Below that were parcel numbers, a date, and the name of a clerk's office. Silas stood in front of the board so long that a woman waiting for the copier cleared her throat. She stepped aside, then came back when the woman left. $7. The amount had the plainness of a dare, though no one had meant it personally. $7 for a condemned mill. $7 for liability. $7 for rot. Warning notices, snakes, taxes, and a building the county had already sentenced in the language of forms. She took Ruth's glove from the truck that evening and unfolded the bills inside. A 5. 2 ones. They had been meant for nothing, or for gas, or for a meal she kept refusing herself. Her mother had tucked them away years earlier, perhaps for offering plate money, perhaps for emergency bread, perhaps for no reason except that women who had known scarcity hid small sums from the future. Silas spread the bills on the steering wheel and smoothed them with both thumbs. Rain ticked on the roof of the truck. Across the parking lot, the library windows glowed with that steady public light given to anyone who can reach it before closing. She looked at the ad again, now folded into her notebook, and something in her chest grew still. Not hopeful. Hope was too large a word and too careless. This was narrower. A line drawn plumb. A measure taken. She had nowhere else to go. That was the truth. But there was another truth beside it, smaller and harder. A mill was not only a building. It was timber, stone, water, bearing, weight, patience, grain, and sound. It was the kind of ruin Asa would have stopped for. It was the kind of place Daniel would have checked with a level before condemning. It was the kind of work no one could flatter, rush, or talk into being better than it was. Before dawn the next morning, Silas put her notebook, her father's plumb bob, the bent nail from Ace's shop, and Ruth's black gloves into a canvas grocery bag. She poured the last of her water into the radiator because the truck had begun running hot, then filled the jug from the library fountain once the doors opened. At noon she bought no lunch. At 1, she drove to the clerk's office with the $7 folded again inside the glove. The road toward Pigeon Forge bent through heat, traffic, and the green shoulders of the Smokies rising beyond the clutter of town. Signs promised cabins, dinner shows, candy, knives, quilts, miracles, and rooms with mountain views. Silas kept both hands on the wheel. The truck rattled under her like a box of loose tools. She did not know then about the stone waiting in the dark. She did not know about the copper tube, or the gold, or the names written by a miller who had forgiven debts no court would ever record. All she knew was that a condemned mill, bought for the price of a meal she had not eaten, was the first thing in 42 days that had not asked her to leave. The bus left her at the edge of town with the kind of sigh that sounded almost human. Silas stood beside the road while the diesel smell thinned behind her and the morning opened in layers, bright on the storefront windows, damp in the ditch grass, blue and wooded where the mountains rose beyond the traffic. She had left the truck 2 miles back in a church gravel lot after the temperature gauge climbed into the red and steam began whispering from beneath the hood. The bus driver, a woman with silver hair cut close to her head, had stopped, though there was no marked stop there, had opened the door with one hand on the lever, and had said only, "Town's as far as I go." So Silas rode the last miles among grocery sacks, 2 children with sticky fingers, and an elderly man holding a cane between his knees. She kept the canvas bag on her lap with both hands over it. The plumb bob rested inside, heavy enough to be felt through the cloth. Ruth's gloves lay folded beside it. Every time the bus turned, the bag shifted gently against her bones. By the time she stepped down, the sky had cleared after a night of rain, and the pavement still held dark seams where water had gathered and begun to dry. She had not slept in the truck the night before. The radiator trouble had made her afraid to run the engine even long enough for warmth, so she had crossed a field behind the church, found a hay barn with one missing wall, and climbed into the loft after checking for fresh droppings, broken boards, and any sign that someone else had claimed it. The hay was old, gray-brown, and smelling of dust and mice. It had scratched her wrists and neck. At 3 a.m, the temperature had dropped to 41 degrees, according to the cracked thermometer, nailed beside the barn door, and she had pulled her coat over her head until her breath dampened the lining. A horse in the neighboring pasture had coughed once in the dark. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked, then gave up. She had slept in pieces. At dawn, she climbed down stiffly and found frost silvering the bottom rails of the fence, though the day would be warm by noon. Her shoes were wet from the field. The hem of her jeans carried burrs. She washed her hands at a spigot behind the church, drank from her cupped palms, and stood there while the first traffic moved along the road with headlights still pale in the dimness. Now, in town, she began walking. Pigeon Forge that morning had the restless face of a place built to be seen by strangers. A pancake house with a red metal roof breathed syrup and frying butter through its open vents. A quilt shop displayed star patterns in its front window. folded so carefully that each point lined up with the next. A knife store had antlers above the door and a carved black bear beside the entrance, its wooden paws shiny from children touching them. There was a laundromat with 5 plastic chairs and a row of bright machines spinning other people's clothes into warm order. Beside it, a cafe called Dolly's Kettle had a chalkboard sign promising biscuits, gravy, and coffee refills, though Silas had nothing to trade for any of it. She passed a bait-and-tackle shop with rain barrels under the eaves, a pharmacy with sun-faded posters, and a small real estate office where mountain cabins were pictured in frames with words like retreat and investment printed beneath them. In the window glass she caught herself briefly, a young woman with slept-in hair, a canvas bag at her side, one shoulder higher than the other from carrying it. She looked away before the reflection became a question. The county clerk's office sat inside a low brick building that looked built for weather rather than welcome. Its flag moved only slightly in the morning air. A magnolia tree stood to one side, its leaves glossy and thick, the ground beneath it littered with last season's leathery brown petals. The concrete steps were clean. The brass rail had been rubbed bright by hands that came needing permission. Record, license, paper, proof. Silas paused at the bottom step and checked the glove. The folded bills remained inside, flattened smooth and soft from their years of waiting. She tucked the glove back into the bag, lifted her chin, and went in. The building smelled of paper, floor wax, and old heat. Fluorescent lights hummed above a corridor lined with framed maps, faded county photographs, notices about property tax deadlines, hunting permits, and meeting schedules. Somewhere behind a closed door, a printer worked in short, irritated bursts. The floor was brown tile, polished in the middle and dull near the baseboards. Her wet shoes made small half-moon prints behind her. At the end of the corridor, a glass window divided the public from the clerks. A bell sat on the counter, though a handwritten sign asked people not to ring unless no one appeared within 5 minutes. Silas stood where a strip of worn tape marked the waiting line and read the notices taped to the glass. Land records, marriage licenses, deeds, probate copies, parcel inquiry, auction deposits. An older woman behind the window was sorting forms into green folders. She was compact and square-shouldered, with iron-gray hair pinned so neatly that not a strand broke rank. Her glasses hung from a beaded chain around her neck, and when she looked up, her eyes were the pale green of creek water over limestone. On the counter before her sat a brass nameplate polished only on the front edge by years of being moved forward and back. Margaret E. Blevins, Skankety clerk. "Can I help you?" "Honey," she said. Not sweetly, but not unkindly either. Silas stepped closer. "I'm here about the auction notice." The mill structure. The woman's hands went still on the folders. Most people knew the difference between surprise and attention, but Mrs. Blevins had clerked long enough to make neither obvious. She set one paper squarely atop another, slid the stack to her left, and reached beneath the counter for a binder with a cracked black spine. "The Walden Creek mill," she said. "Yes, Mom." Mrs. Blevins opened the binder and turned several pages. The paper inside was thick, copied many times, full of stamps and marginal notes. She licked no finger, wasted no motion. "You are the bidder listed here." "Yes, Mom." The clerk looked over the rim of her glasses. "Do you understand what you are purchasing?" Silas felt the room narrow around that word. Purchasing sounded almost grand, as if she had chosen between wallpaper patterns or a pasture boundary. She nodded. "I need you to answer out loud for the record." "Yes, Mom. Mrs. Blevins drew a form from the binder and laid it flat. You understand the property has no working utilities? Yes. Mom. You understand the county has not warranted road access beyond the recorded easement, and that the lane may be impassable after rain? Yes. Mom. You understand the building has been declared unsafe for occupants? Yes. Mom. You understand there is no well inspection, no septic certificate, no roof certification, no survey update, and no assurance that any portion of the structure can legally be repaired without permit? Yes. Mom. You understand the demolition order remains active unless you petition for a stay and show visible progress before the scheduled date. Silas's throat tightened around the answer, but she gave it. Yes. Hom. Mrs. Blevins studied her, not with pity, and that helped. Pity would have undone something. It would have made the clean counter, the polished nameplate, the orderly folders all seem like parts of another country. You got a place to stay tonight? The clerk asked. Silas looked at the form. That isn't part of the record, Mrs. Blevins said. No, Mom, Silas answered. Then, because lies have become too heavy to carry, she added, not unless this counts. The clerk took off her glasses and folded them. For a moment, the official room became almost human. The printer went quiet. A phone rang somewhere and was answered in another office by a voice saying, Sevier County Clerk. Please hold. Mrs. Blevins put her glasses back on. I cannot advise you to sleep in a condemned structure, she said. Yes. Mom. I cannot stop you from standing on land you own once this deed records. Yes. Mom. And I cannot make that building safer by warning you about it. Silas met her eyes then. No. Mom. The clerk nodded once, as if a difficult measurement had been taken and found straight. She turned to a drawer, removed a blue ink pen attached to no chain, and set it before Silas with the point facing toward her. There are 3 signatures and 2 initials. Print your name exactly as it appears on your identification. Silas took out her driver's license. The plastic had a crack through one corner. Mrs. Blevins copied the number into a ledger, then turned the form toward Silas and tapped the first line. The pen felt too fine in her hand. She printed carefully. Her letters looked plain and young on the official paper. She signed where told, initialed where marked, and watched each blank become less blank. Mrs. Blevins carried the papers to a machine at the far end of the counter, pressed them beneath a flat plate, and pulled down a lever. The brass stamp came down with a sound like a small gate closing. Embossed paper. Recorded seal. Date. Book. Page. It was not a welcome. It was not a blessing. But it was a line. The clerk counted no coins allowed, asked no unnecessary question, and issued a receipt with a narrow strip of paper still warm from the printer. Then she opened a drawer beneath the counter, withdrew a folded county road map, and marked it with a yellow highlighter. You go out through town, past the mill supply place and the old cemetery road, she said. This here is Walden Creek Road. It does not look like much because it is not much. You'll pass a white mailbox with no house visible, then a pair of stone gate posts. Do not turn there. That land belongs to the McCarter family, and their dog believes the county line is wherever he is standing. Silas almost smiled. Keep walking until the pavement narrows and you see 3 walnut trees on the left. The lane drops behind them. If you reach the creek bridge with the green rail, you have gone too far. Yes. Mom. Mrs. Blevins drew another mark, slower this time. The mill sits back from the road. You may not see it until you're near the water. Silas folded the map and placed it in the bag with the receipt. The clerk did not move away. Her gaze had lowered to the driver's license still on the counter, to the name printed there, then to Silas's face. "Whitaker," she said. Silas touched the strap of the bag. "Yes." "Mom. Any relation to the man who used to repair stonework up toward Ware's Valley?" The question entered quietly, but it changed the air. Silas did not answer at once. She saw a cabin wall with pale rectangles where tools had hung. She saw the bent nail in her palm. She saw a cane leaning against a chopping block in November light. "He was my father's uncle," she said. "Mrs." Blevins looked down at the papers as though they had begun speaking a second language. "He came in here years ago. More than once. Always had dust on his cuffs. Not dirt. Stone dust. There is a difference." Silas waited. "He asked about that same mill," the clerk continued. "Not buying it." "Exactly." "Asked who owned it. Whether the raceway was still recorded. Whether any of the original works were listed in the old inventory. I was younger then. I told him most of what we had was incomplete." Her thumb rested on the edge of the ledger. "He said there were places in these hills that had been forgotten by paperwork but not by water." Silas looked at the brass stamp. At the counter, at the clerk's careful hands. She wanted to ask what else he had said, whether he had stood where she stood now, whether he had known something and failed to tell her because there had not been time. But the question would have required a steadier voice than she had. "Mrs." Blevins seemed to understand this. She reached beneath the counter again and took out a small envelope. "This was copied from an older tax plat," she said. "It may not be useful. But if he had lived long enough to come back asking, I expect he would have wanted the lines." Silas accepted the envelope. It weighed almost nothing. Some gifts are like that. Almost nothing to the hand, considerable elsewhere. "Thank you," she said. "Mrs." Blevins pressed the deed packet flat, slipped it into a manila folder, and slid it through the opening at the bottom of the glass. "File your petition within 10 business days. You will need photographs. If you do not own a camera, the library can print from a phone, but that assumes you have one. I do not." The clerk's mouth tightened, not in disapproval. "Then draw what you can. Measurements help. Dated notes help. Receipts help. Government believes paper because paper does not look hungry." Silas placed the folder carefully in her bag. At the doorway, she turned back. "Mrs." Blevins had already resumed sorting green folders, but she looked up once more. "Miss Whit—" "Yes." "Mom." "Mind the floor inside. Mills rot from beneath first." Silas nodded and stepped into the light. The walk out of town took longer than the map implied. Roads on paper had no heat, no grade, no gravel sliding under worn soles. She passed the mill supply place with its stacks of feed sacks, galvanized tubs, and seed packets turning slowly in a wire rack near the door. Then came a barbecue stand not yet open for the day, its smoker cold but fragrant with hickory from the night before. A sign for a cabin rental company leaned at the edge of a ditch. Past that, the traffic thinned, and the mountains gathered themselves closer. Walden Creek Road began without ceremony. The pavement narrowed and lost its painted lines. Blackberry canes grew along the shoulder in tangled arcs. The drainage ditch held last night's rain in brown pools, each one filmed with pollen. A crow walked across the road ahead of her, lifting its feet in that deliberate way birds have when they know they are not the ones trespassing. She found the white mailbox, rust streaking down from its flag. No house showed through the trees. Only a gravel track that disappeared into rhododendron and shadow. Farther on stood the stone gateposts Mrs. Blevins had warned her about. They were square, lichen-covered, and capped with concrete pyramids. Behind them, a pasture sloped upward to a clapboard house with a deep porch and 3 metal chairs. The dog appeared before the bark did. He was yellow, broad-headed, and elderly enough to have white around his muzzle, but not elderly enough to give up authority. He came to the fence line stiff-legged, raised his head, and announced his opinion of the entire county. Silas stopped walking. She did not look directly at him. Dogs, like men in offices, sometimes mistook eye contact for argument. "Not your road," she said softly. The dog barked twice more, then followed inside the fence as she passed, keeping pace until the pasture ended. At the final post, he gave one last low sound, less threat than duty, and returned to the house. The day warmed. Silas took off her coat and folded it over one arm. Twice she stopped to adjust the canvas bag. Once she sat on a culvert and removed a stone from her shoe. Water moved beneath the culvert in a cramped silver trickle. Beyond the trees, somewhere lower, a larger creek spoke with a steady undertone, not loud enough to command attention, but constant enough to reshape it. Then she saw the walnut trees. There were 3, as the clerk had said, standing together on the left side of the road like old witnesses who had agreed not to correct each other. Their trunks were dark and deeply furrowed. New leaves had opened along the branches in green, folded hands. The ground beneath them was littered with black hulls from last fall, softened by weather, pressed into the mud by deer hooves and tires. Behind the trees, half hidden by bramble and spicebush, a lane dropped toward the creek. It had once been graveled. Silas could tell by the pale stones surfacing beneath moss and weeds, but rain had cut channels through it, and roots had lifted places into knuckled ridges. She descended carefully, one hand brushing the trunks of saplings for balance. The air changed as she went down. Cooler. Wetter. The smell of traffic fell away, replaced by leaf mold, creek water, and the faint mineral odor of stone kept in shade. The first part of the mill she saw was not the building. It was the wheel, or what remained of it. It stood on the creek side, 20 feet in diameter perhaps, though the lower quarter had sunk into silt and weed. Its spokes were gray with age and broken in 3 places. Iron bands circled the rim, rust-thick and flaking. Several buckets had fallen away, leaving gaps where water could pass through without purpose. A thin vine had climbed one side and sent tendrils through the hub as if the earth had tried to lace the wheel shut. Then the building emerged behind it. The mill was larger than the word ruin had allowed her to imagine. 2 stories at the front, 1.5 at the rear where the ground rose toward the road. Its foundation was fieldstone, dry-laid in places, mortared in others, with gaps where water and years had tested the joints. The lower walls were heavy oak beams, darkened nearly black, joined with pegs large as broom handles. Above them, weathered poplar boards ran vertical beneath a roof of failing tin and missing shingles, the whole ridge sagging toward the creek as if tired of holding up sky. A narrow chimney of stacked stones stood at the uphill end, patched badly with later brick near the top. The door was made of wide planks and hung from strap hinges, one of which had pulled loose so the door leaned inward without fully closing. Beside it, nailed under the porch roof, was a hand-painted sign so faded that the words appeared and disappeared depending on where she stood. Hollow Branch Mill. Corn ground daily, hustmal tall. The porch was not a porch so much as an argument with gravity. 3 boards remained solid. 2 were broken through. One had curled upward at the end like a dried leaf. Silas stood before it and did not step immediately. She set down the bag, took out the plumb bob, and held it by the string before the doorframe. The brass weight hung still. The frame leaned left. She gave one small nod, not because the news was good, but because it was honest. She walked around the building first. Asa would have made her. The creek ran behind it, clear over stone, quickened where the old raceway narrowed and guided water toward the dead wheel. The mill race itself was choked with leaves, branch fall, and silt, but its shape remained readable. Upstream, a low diversion dam made of fitted stone had split and settled, yet enough water still slid along the old channel to keep it damp and moss-bright. The rear wall worried her most. One sill beam had softened where splashback from the wheel had struck it for decades. She pressed the tip of a fallen branch into the wood, and it sank farther than it should have. Above that, the clapboards bowed outward. A window on the second level had lost its glass and taken in birds. Their nesting grass hung over the sill like uncombed hair. On the uphill side, briars covered a second door, smaller and lower, likely leading to storage or the mealroom. The stone foundation there seemed firmer. A patch of daffodils had risen near the wall, blind yellow heads opening in the neglect. Someone had planted them. Or someone had dropped bulbs in a year when the mill still mattered, and the flowers had kept their own calendar ever since. Silas returned to the front. She tested the first porch board with 1 foot. It groaned but held. The second shifted. She stepped over it. The third accepted her weight with a dry complaint. At the door, a county notice had been stapled through the wood in a clear plastic sleeve. The paper inside had curled from damp. Unsafe in structure. Demolition order pending. She did not remove it. The latch lifted after 3 tries. The door opened inward 6 inches and stopped against debris. She leaned her shoulder carefully into it. Something scraped across the floor. A smell came out, old and deep, not merely dust but grain dust. Mouse nest, wet wood, cold ashes, iron, and the sour trace of animal entry. It was the smell of a place that had been closed without being emptied. She pushed again. The door gave enough for her to slip through sideways. Inside, the light fell in narrow bands through cracks in the siding and the broken upper window. The front room had once received farmers, neighbors, sacks of corn and wheat, talk of weather, births, debts, frost, and harvest. Now it held the settled silence of things left mid-sentence. A counter ran along one wall, its top scarred by knives, weights, and perhaps elbows. Behind it stood shelves with a few cloudy jars, a tin scoop, and a stack of paper sacks gone soft at the edges. The floorboards were wide, dark, and uneven. She stood still and let her eyes adjust before trusting them. To her right, the great grinding stones sat inside their wooden vat, the upper stone fixed above the lower, both enclosed by a round wooden tun whose staves had shrunk apart. The hopper above them leaned to one side, its funnel-shaped boards warped but not broken. A leather belt hung slack from an overhead pulley, stiff as a dead snake. Iron gears rested below the stone platform in a pit guarded by a loose railing. There was more machinery than she had expected. Shafting ran through the wall toward the wheel. Wooden cogs, some missing teeth, waited in shadow. A bolter frame stood along the far side, its silk cloth torn and hanging. A grain elevator with small wooden cups rose toward the second floor, frozen in place. Everything was coated in the fine gray powder of age, but beneath the dust the mill had a form. It had not collapsed into a jumble. It had paused. Silas took one step. The floor answered with a long creak from somewhere beneath her left foot. She shifted her weight back and marked the sound in memory. Another step, another answer. A place spoke first through its dangers. If a person listened, it did not have to shout. In the back room, the air was colder. This space had likely served as a workroom and rough dwelling when long grinding days ran late. There was a small iron stove in one corner, its pipe angled into the chimney with 3 mismatched elbows. A table stood under the rear window, one leg braced by a stack of slate pieces. On the table lay a rusted oil lamp, a cracked mug, and a wooden ruler blackened at one end. Along the wall hung empty pegs. Beneath them sat a bench with a vise attached, the screw seized with rust but still proud. There was also a narrow cot frame without a mattress. Silas stood before it longer than she meant to. The frame was made of oak, pegged at the corners, with rope laced across the middle and a sagging grid. On the floor beside it were a few corn husks, mouse droppings, and a square of paper so damp it had become part of the dirt. The sight of the cot did not comfort her. It made the room more particular. Someone had once slept here because work required it, or poverty did, or winter came early, or a storm made the creek road impassable. She opened the rear door after clearing a fallen board from its base. It stuck, then swung outward to reveal a shallow stoop of 2 stone slabs and a view of the creek bending around a bank of ferns. The sound of water entered at once, clear and continuous. Not loud. Enough. She spent the remaining daylight making the first decisions. Not repairs. Not yet. Only decisions that kept a person alive until morning. She dragged 3 loose boards away from the door and stacked them where no foot would find them in the dark. She tested the stovepipe with both hands and found it loose at the second elbow, so she did not build a fire. She cleared a rectangle of floor in the back room with a scrap of cardboard and a broom she found behind the counter, its straw worn down almost to the binding. Dust rose in patient veils. She tied a handkerchief over her mouth, waited for the air to settle, and swept again. The broom made a dry whisper over the boards. Near sunset, she walked to the creek with the empty water jug. She did not drink directly from it. Even desperation had its rules. She filled the jug for washing, then sat on a stone and took inventory of what she had brought. Plumb bob, gloves, bent nail, notebook, pencil, receipt, copied plat, 2 shirts, 1 pair of socks, coat, half a sleeve of crackers, a pocket knife with a loose blade, comb, soap, and the paper sack of medicine bottles she still had not thrown away. The evening cooled quickly in the hollow. She ate 3 crackers and drank the last clean water from the bottle she had carried in. Hunger moved inside her with a dull, practical insistence. She folded the deed packet into the notebook and placed both beneath her coat, not because anyone was likely to come, but because paper had become land, and land had become a floor where she might sleep. Before dark, she went outside once more and looked at the building from the lane. The mill did not become prettier in evening light. That would have been false. The sag remained. The broken wheel remained. The roofline still bent toward failure. Yet shadow gathered around it in a way that softened nothing and revealed more. Its stones held the cool of the creek. Its timbers bore marks made by broad axes and hands long gone. The sign under the eave, nearly unreadable at noon, showed one word clearly now. Daily. Silas read it twice. Inside, she spread her coat on the swept rectangle of floor. She used the canvas bag as a pillow after removing the plumb bob, because the brass weight pressed hard through the cloth. The back room darkened by degrees. First the corners went, then the machinery in the front room, then the window frames, until only the pale rectangle of the rear doorway remained, and then that too became part of the room. Night in the mill was not empty. A mouse moved somewhere behind the shelves. Water struck stone outside in repeating measures. The building settled as the temperature dropped, each old joint giving a careful tick or sigh. Wind found the broken upper window and crossed the open space above the stones. Once, something larger than a mouse moved beneath the porch, paused, and went on. Silas lay on her side with her knees drawn up, one hand around the plumb bob. The floor was hard. Her coat smelled of hay, rain, and truck vinyl. Dust prickled at her throat despite the handkerchief. She could feel cold rising through the boards, a slow and exact cold that belonged to water, stone, and shaded ground. Yet no one knocked on the window. No one asked her to move along. No one slid a paper across a table and told her there was nothing left. At some hour before midnight, she reached into the canvas bag and found Ruth's gloves by touch. She folded them beneath her cheek. The leather was thin, almost weightless, warmed after a few minutes by her skin. In the dark front room, the Millstone sat unseen, their round bodies holding their secret with the patience of buried things. The mill had been waiting. Morning came through the cracked siding in thin strips, and Silas rose before the light had reached the floor. Her body had stiffened around the shape of the boards. One hip ached. Her shoulder had gone numb where the plumb bob had pressed through the folded coat sometime in the night. For a minute she lay still and let the room return to her in pieces, the stove dark in the corner, the bench against the wall, the pale ribs of the cot frame, the steady creak beyond the rear door. Then a drop of water fell somewhere near the front room and struck metal with a small, exact sound. She sat up. The first 3 days became a study in what could be trusted. She did not begin with the roof, or the wheel, or the machinery, though each one called attention to itself in its own damaged way. She began with water, shelter, and the ground beneath her feet. A person who had slept in vehicles and borrowed corners learned to respect the order of needs. First, something to drink. Then a place to relieve herself without sickness or shame. Then a path through the building that would not betray her after dark. The well stood uphill from the mill, half hidden under a rusted tin cover in a square frame of locust posts. She found it by following the old path from the back door through spicebush and nettle, where a line of flat stones, nearly swallowed by soil, led toward a clearing. The hand pump had been removed long ago, leaving only a capped pipe and a collar of concrete cracked by root pressure. Beside it lay the pump handle, red with rust, as if someone had set it down in irritation and died before returning. She took the cover off carefully. The well was stone-lined, round, and colder than the morning air. When she dropped a pebble, it took 2 full breaths before the sound came back. Water. Deep enough. Not clean enough to trust, but present. She wrote it down in her notebook, well intact. Cap damaged. Pump absent. Water audible. Then she set the cover back, weighted it with 2 stones, and marked the path with 3 broken branches so she could find it again if rain came. The outhouse stood farther up, behind a young cedar that had grown close enough to scratch its roof. It was narrow, leaning but not fallen, with a crescent moon cut into the door and a wasp nest tucked high under one eave. Silas approached with a stick and waited. No wasps came out. The seatboard had split down the middle, and the pit below smelled of damp leaves rather than use, which told her more years had passed than trouble. She wedged the door open with a stone, scraped out old nests with a branch, and decided she could manage until she could do better. After that she learned the floor. She walked the front room with her notebook open, marking each plank by sound. Near the counter, the boards gave a dry, shallow creak but held firm. 3 feet from the millstones, the left-hand board dipped with a warning softness, so she marked it with a strip torn from the edge of a paper sack and weighted both ends with nails scavenged from the corner. At the railing above the gear pit, the floor sounded hollow in a different way. Not rotten, perhaps, but unsupported beneath. She did not trust it. She gave names to the paths she could take: door to back room to creek, counter to front window, stove to rear door. She made herself walk them in daylight until her feet knew where to go without asking her eyes. At night, when the mill became shape and breath, she moved only along those lines. She did not hurry. Buildings that had waited 40 years punished haste without anger. On the second day, she cleared debris from the front threshold and dragged out a nest of dry leaves, bottle caps, old twine, 2 bones too small to identify, and a length of rotted sackcloth that fell apart in her hands. On the third, she found a half-barrel under the counter, carried it outside, rinsed it 3 times with creek water, and set it beneath a roof leak to catch rain. Nothing about that was proper. It was simply less improper than going without. By then hunger had made the edges of things shine. She walked back toward town on the 4th morning, carrying the canvas bag, the receipt, and a list written in pencil with no expectation that she could afford half of it. The air smelled of warming mud and wild onion crushed along the shoulder. The McCarter dog met her at his fence, barked once, recognized her poverty as a repeated fact, and watched in silence as she passed. The hardware store was older than most of the bright places along the main road. It sat back from the street beneath a faded green awning, with seed packets in one window and a display of axe handles in the other. The sign above the door read Herget Hardware and Feed, though the ampersand had lost most of its paint. A bell rang when Silas entered, a real brass bell, not an electronic chime, and the sound seemed to belong to floors that knew boots better than sneakers. Inside, the air held a complicated comfort burlap, oiled metal, fertilizer, cedar shavings, kerosene, dusty cardboard, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a hot plate. Narrow aisles ran between shelves stacked with mason jars, hinges, fence staples, stovepipe elbows, lamp wicks, mousetraps, rope, galvanized nails, work gloves, canning lids, seed corn, mineral blocks, and bins of loose bolts labeled by hand. Light came through high windows and turned the dust visible. A man stood behind the counter repairing a drawknife handle. He was in his 70s, tall but stooped through the upper back, with white hair cut unevenly and ears reddened by years of sun. His shirt cuffs were rolled twice. One thumbnail had been split long ago and had grown back-ridged. He wore a leather apron darkened where tools had leaned against it. Behind him, on shelves that reached nearly to the ceiling, sat coffee cans full of screws, ledger books, brass fittings, old catalogs, and a radio playing weather in a low voice. He looked at Silas once and returned to the drawknife. "You need something measured or something guessed," he said. Silas set her list on the counter. "Measured, if I can afford it." He read the paper without touching it at first, then put down the drawknife and turned it toward the light. "Stovepipe brush. Work gloves. 1 pound 8-penny nails.
Half-pound 10-penny.
Flashlight batteries. Mouse traps. Mason's twine. 2 wedges. A scrub brush. Kerosene. You got an old place or an angry landlord? Old place. How old? I do not know. He glanced at her then, and whatever he saw made him take a second look at the list. You the one bought Hollow Branch. Silas did not ask how he knew. Small towns carried news the way creeks carried leaves. Yes, sir. He picked up the list and read it again, slower. Names Emmett Hargett. Silas Whitaker. At that, his expression changed, though not dramatically. It was only a settling around the eyes, a door in memory opening on its own hinge. Whitaker, he said. Haas's people. Yes, sir. Stone dust on the cuffs, he murmured, almost to himself. I should have known. Silas stood still. Mr. Hargett turned and took a ledger from beneath the counter. It was black, broad, and softened at the corners, with alphabetical tabs along the side. He opened it to W, found a blank line with one finger, and wrote her name before she understood what he was doing. I cannot pay for all of it today, she said. I did not ask for credit. No, he repeated. You came in with a list that starts with chimney and ends with traps. That is better than asking. He wrote Hollow Branch Mill under her name, then drew a line in the debit column. Store account. 30 days if you can. 60 if you cannot. No foolishness. No paint colors until the roof holds. No buying a thing because it makes you feel less cold. Silas's hands folded once against the counter, then released. I do not know when I will have money. He capped the pen. Most people who do know are lying. She looked toward the shelves because his kindness was too direct to face. On the wall behind the counter hung a row of yellowed booklets, home masonry repairs, farm roof maintenance, safe wiring for outbuildings, wood stove care, basic water systems. Their covers had faded illustrations of men in hats doing useful things without complaint. Mr. Hargett took one down and laid it on the counter. The booklet was titled Practical Repairs for Rural Buildings, revised 1968. The corner had been chewed by mice. Several pages were marked with paper slips. That one's free, he said. I cannot. You can if I say it is free. She touched the cover lightly. Why? He leaned both hands on the counter. His fingers were long, the knuckles swollen, the nails clean but permanently dark at the edges. Because that mill should have come down years ago or been saved years ago. Since nobody did either, I have curiosity invested. That does not sound like charity. It is not. Charity makes people act grateful before they have had breakfast. I dislike it. Silas almost smiled, and this time the expression reached her mouth before she could stop it. He began gathering supplies with a pencil tucked behind his ear. The work gloves were the cheapest leather pair, factory stiff but sound, marked $3.49. A round chimney brush, 6 inches, with wire bristles and threaded stem, 8 25s. Fiberglass rods, 3 sections. Used but serviceable, 2,000s for the set because one brass coupling was dented. A pound of 8-penny common nails, $1.18. Half a pound of 10-penny, 74 cents. 2 cold chisels from a discount bin. One with a mushroomed head he warned her to file before striking, $1.50 together. Mason's twine, 63 cents. 2 wooden wedges, 40 cents. A scrub brush, 89 cents. Mouse traps, 4 for $1.12. Kerosene by the quart, 35 cents. A small tin of stove blacking with a cracked lid, 29 cents. Used flashlight batteries from behind the counter, no charge, though he wrote batteries. Used, tested in the margin anyway. He added a paper packet of safety matches and did not list them. "Do not burn that place down trying to get warm," he said. "No, sir." "Do not trust a chimney because smoke goes upward once." "No, sir." "Do not step on a board that has already warned you." "No, sir." He tied the smaller things into a flour sack and helped balance the brush rods over her shoulder. Before she left, he opened the repair booklet and tapped a chapter with his finger. Chimneys first. Creosote burns mean. Birds build where smoke used to be. If you see glaze black inside the pipe, scrape until your arm hates you. How long will it? Longer than you. That was the only answer he gave. Back at the mill, Silas began with the stovepipe. She carried the pipe sections outside one at a time, marking their order with scratches so she could reassemble them. The first elbow came loose after she worked the rusted seam with the edge of the chisel and tapped gently with a board. Soot fell out in black sheets, not powder. The second elbow was worse. It held a nest of twigs, grass, feathers, and something woven from blue plastic ribbon. She shook it into a pit she scraped near the creek, then prodded through the mass until no hidden ember of life objected. She covered her hair with Ruth's scarf, tied the handkerchief over her mouth, and climbed onto the back room table to reach the chimney thimble. The brick around it had cracked, but the opening itself was clear enough for the brush. She screwed the first fiberglass rod into the brush, pushed it up until resistance met her, twisted clockwise as the booklet instructed, and worked it down and up in careful strokes. Soot rained onto the sheet of newspaper she had spread below. Then larger pieces came. Dry flakes first, then hard black scales with a terry shine. Creosote. She remembered the word from Mr. Hargit's mouth and from the booklet diagram showing chimney fires like arrows inside a flue. She added the second rod, then the third, shoulders burning as she forced the brush higher. Each stroke made a different sound: rasp, scrape, dull knock where the brush struck an offset, then a gritty rush as loosened deposits fell. The work took 5 hours the first day and 3 the next. She cleaned from below because the roof could not yet be trusted. Between sessions, she went outside and struck the pipe sections with a stick, loosening scale, then scraped the inside with a wire loop she made from a bent coat hanger found behind the counter. Her fingers blackened to the first knuckle. Soot entered the lines beside her nose and would not wash out with cold creek water. Twice she stopped to cough until her eyes watered. Once she sat on the back stoop with her head between her knees, breathing through the handkerchief, listening to the creek and the dull complaint of hunger. On the second evening, she held a mirror shard under the chimney opening and used the flashlight to throw light upward. The flue looked rough but open. No nest. No glossy sheet. No obvious blockage. That did not make it safe. It made it possible. She reassembled the stovepipe with the seams facing upward and the elbows seated tighter than before. She packed the thimble gap temporarily with a paste of creek mud and ash, not as a true repair, only to slow the smoke until she could learn better. Then she set a handful of dry twigs in the stove, added shavings made with her pocket knife from a fallen cedar branch, and placed 3 small splits of punky wood beside them. Her first match broke. The second flared. She held it under the cedar shavings until flame took, then closed the stove door almost all the way and watched through the draft opening. Smoke hesitated, rolled, pressed briefly toward the room, then turned upward. The pipe ticked as it warmed. A thin gray thread emerged from the chimney outside, visible through the rear window, then steadied and lifted into the evening. Silas stood with one hand on the table. The fire was not large. It was not enough to warm the whole building. But heat came from it, plain and bodily, touching her fingers first, then her knees, then the front of her coat. She fed it slowly, refusing the comfort of haste. When the stovetop grew hot enough, she set a dented tin can of creek water on it and boiled the water for 10 full minutes by the clock in her head, counting too slowly rather than too fast. Into that water she crumbled the last of the crackers and stirred in a spoonful of peanut butter scraped from the jar she had bought the week before. The meal looked poor, beige and uneven, but steam rose from it. She ate with the cracked mug's handle turned away from her, because it had split at the join. Warm food changed the room. Not beautifully. Honestly. After the first fire, she began inventorying the workroom. She did it the way Asa had taught her to sharpen tools, without skipping because impatience wanted to become intelligence. She cleared the bench first. Rusted nails, 12. Bent finishing nails, 19. One square nut, likely from machinery, set aside in the jar marked iron unknown. A broken awl handle without its steel. 3 leather washers, dried hard. 2 lengths of cotton sash cord, too rotten to trust. A tin funnel with a seam split along the side. 1 bottle of lamp oil, empty but capped. 1 rasp with half its teeth clogged by gray material. A cabinet scraper, pitted but usable. 2 wooden pegs. A slotted screwdriver with a cracked handle. A hand broom made of broomcorn and twine, delicate from age. She opened each drawer in the bench with both hands. The first held paper sacks folded flat. The second held a mouse nest inside a woman's stocking, which she carried outside on a shovel blade and buried. The third was stuck. She worked it for nearly 20 minutes, shifting pressure left and right, tapping the runner, lifting as she pulled. When it came free, it released the smell of cedar and dust. Inside lay a carpenter's pencil worn down to 2 inches, a brass cabinet latch, a folded paper pattern for a grain sack, 3 pieces of chalk, and a whetstone broken cleanly in half. She held the stone longer than the others. Not Asa's. She knew that at once. Different color, different grit, different life. Still, it had been held by someone who cared about an edge. She placed it on the bench near the plumb bob and kept working. Along the wall by the stove she found stacked boards, mostly warped, but 2 lengths of oak remained straight enough for bracing. Under the cot frame she found a coil of wire, a cracked enamel basin, and a pair of shoes so stiff with age that they seemed carved rather than sewn. Behind the stove, in a pocket of shadow, she found a small iron kettle with a hole in the bottom and a child's marble, blue glass with a white twist inside. The front room took longer. She listed the machinery without pretending to understand all of it. Counter, shelves, grain scale with missing pan, toll box, empty, hopper, warped, shoe, present, damsel rod, loose, upper stone housing, cracked stave, lower stone unseen, crane arm for lifting stone, present but seized, iron eye bolt, rusted, gear pit railing, unsafe, main shaft, visible at wall, pulley, overhead, leather belt, split, bolter frame, cloth torn, meal chute, clogged, elevator cups, several broken. Sacks. Ruined. Rat damage. Extensive. Bird entry. Upper window. Then she came to the millstones. They sat in the center of the room with a gravity that seemed different from everything else. The wooden vat around them, the tun, had shrunk and split, but the stones themselves remained nearly whole. The upper stone was gray, banded faintly with blue, its surface hidden except where the wooden casing had opened. The eye at the center, where grain would once have entered, was covered by a round cedar disc darkened by time. A square iron fitting crossed above it, connected to a spindle that descended toward the lower works. Silas did not touch it the first day. Respect and caution had similar hands. On the next morning, after checking the stove ashes and resetting 2 mouse traps, she brought the plumb bob, pencil, notebook, and the broken whetstone to the stones. She had read in the repair booklet only a paragraph about mills, not enough to guide her, so she relied on what Asa had taught her about weight and sound. Stone spoke when struck properly. Not loudly, not theatrically, but density, fracture, bedding, hollowness, and flaw each had a voice. She tapped the exposed rim of the upper stone with the wooden handle of the screwdriver. Talk. Talk! Talk. The sound was dull, consistent, heavy. She moved around the circle, tapping every handspan, marking nothing at first. Near the rear side, where the light from the broken window fell at an angle, the sound changed. Talk! Talk. Ton. She stopped. The third note was not empty exactly. It was lower, rounder, less final. She tapped again, softer. Ton. She tapped 6 inches to the left. Talk. 6 inches right. Talk. Back to the place. Ton. Her skin tightened along her arms, though the room was not cold. She knelt and looked closely. Dust filled every groove and seam. The cedar disc over the eye appeared plain, but one edge sat perhaps a finger's width lower than the other. She brushed away dust with the hand broom. The grain of the disc emerged, radial and dark, pegged in place with 4 dowels. 3 dowels were cedar. The 4th was oak. That difference did not belong. She pressed the oak dowel with her thumb. Nothing moved. She scraped around it with the pocket knife, careful not to pry too hard. The dowel had been stained to match, but not perfectly. Beneath the stain, the rim showed paler wood. She looked for tool marks and found 2 shallow crescent cuts opposite each other, almost hidden beneath grime. The kind made by a spanner or a pair of pins. Not a dowel. A plug. She sat back on her heels. The old crane arm above the stone, used to lift the runner for dressing, could not be trusted. The fitting was rusted. The beam it attached to had checked along one side. She had no business moving a millstone. A stone that size could crush a foot. A hand, a life. Without noticing. Yet the anomaly was not beneath the stone. It was in the cedar disc covering the eye. She spent an hour making a tool from what she had. 2 10-penny nails, their points filed flat against the broken whetstone. A strip of oak from a ruined crate. Holes bored shallow with the awl handle and the pocket knife tip. Nails set through the strip at the same distance as the crescent marks. It was crude. Asa would have made her do it twice. But when she set the nail ends into the marks and turned slowly, the oak plug shifted. A small circle of old dirt broke at its rim. Silas stopped and listened. The mill listened back. She turned again. The plug rose a fraction, then resisted. She worked it back and forth. Patient, careful, afraid of ruining whatever thread or latch lay hidden below. At last the plug came free with a dry click. Beneath it was a narrow hole, just wide enough for 2 fingers, and within that hole a strip of tarnished brass lay folded against the inner wall. She hooked it with the bent nail from Asa's shop. The brass strip lifted. Something inside the cedar disc released. Not dramatically, only a settled wooden sigh. The disc did not open upward. It rotated. Silas placed both palms against its edge and turned it a few inches counterclockwise. A seam appeared where no seam had been visible before, an arc cut so exactly that dust had hidden it for decades. She turned until the disc stopped, then lifted. The cedar cover came away, heavier than it looked. Below was the eye of the stone, but the opening had been altered. Where grain should have dropped through, a cylindrical cavity had been fitted with a copper sleeve, green at the edges with age. Inside the sleeve, wrapped in oilcloth, sat 3 packages wedged so neatly that they could not have arrived there by accident. Silas did not reach in at once. She went to the door and looked outside. No one stood in the lane. No vehicle waited beyond the walnut trees. The creek moved as it had moved all morning, indifferent and faithful. She returned, wiped her hands on her jeans, and lifted the first package. It was long, narrow, and tied with cotton cord that had browned but not broken. The oilcloth stuck to itself when she unwrapped it. Inside lay tools. Not new, not decorative, but kept with reverence. 3 carving chisels with boxwood handles darkened by use, a small stone dressers, pick with a head no longer than her palm, a sharpening slip wrapped in wool, and a wooden mallet whose face bore the pale scars of careful striking. A paper label, brittle and folded around the handles, read for the hand that still knows how to listen. Silas placed each tool on the bench as if setting down bones. The second package was square and heavier. It held raw material, 2 small blocks of fine-grained marble, 1 creamy white and 1 gray with soft veining, a packet of powdered red ochre, 3 brass templates cut into leaf and wheat shapes, and a bundle of thin walnut strips, straight and cured, likely meant for inlay or pattern work. Between the stone blocks lay a folded cloth containing tiny steel punches, each marked with a different symbol: star, wheat head, crescent, crosshatch, and a small water wheel with 8 spokes. The third package was a tin box. It had been soldered once, then sealed again with wax. Around it, tucked to fill the remaining space, were 2 leather pouches and a paper-wrapped cylinder that proved to be the copper tube itself, capped and soldered at both ends. The tube was as long as her forearm and cool in her hands. Its seam had been worked smooth. On one end, someone had scratched a small mark with a point, a wheel inside a circle. Silas carried everything to the back room table. She did not open the tube first. Some instinct, perhaps inherited from people who had survived by order, made her begin with the leather pouches. The first held coins. Gold coins. She knew that much before she knew anything else, because even in dim light they carried a warmth no brass imitation could keep. They slid into her palm heavy and soft-edged from handling long ago. She closed her hand around them and then opened it again. There were Liberty Head double eagles, $20 pieces dated 1881, 1895, 1904. There were Indian head eagles, $10 pieces, darker in the recesses. There were half eagles, $5 gold coins, some with Liberty's profile worn smooth enough to look tired. There were quarter eagles, small and exact, and 2 $1 gold coins so modest they seemed almost shy among the rest. The second pouch held more of the same, wrapped in paper rolls labeled in brown ink. She counted on the table because the bed of her palm could not be trusted. Not with this. She made columns in the notebook. Face value first because it was the only value she could know. $20 coins, 61. $10 coins, 48. $5 coins, 72. $2.50 coins, 86. $1 coins, 13. A few silver dollars lay in a separate wrap, Morgan dollars mostly, and a small stack of barber halves tied with red thread. Face value, $2,297.50. But folded into the bottom of the first pouch was a modern appraisal slip, yellowed but not ancient, dated 1978 from a coin dealer in Knoxville. It listed the same coins by type, year, and condition, with handwritten market values beside them. Someone had added a later penciled estimate in the margin, perhaps before sealing them away for good. Estimated replacement value, $55,374. Silas stared at the number until the digits stopped making sense. $55,318.74. Not enough to turn a person into a queen, as storybooks might have wanted. Not enough to make land unhurt or the dead return. But enough to repair a roof if spent slowly. Enough to stop hunger from making every decision. Enough to place time between herself and the next locked door. She did not shout. She did not laugh. She sat down on the cot frame because her knees had begun to loosen. The tin box came next. The wax cracked under the pocket knife. The lid resisted, then lifted with a small flake of rust falling from one hinge. Inside lay a ledger wrapped in brown cloth, a sealed envelope, a military medal in a square cardboard case, and several folded receipts tied with black thread. The medal was bronze, suspended from a faded ribbon. On the back was engraved T. H. Mallory, 1918. The year sat there plainly, carrying with it mud, ships, telegrams, mothers at windows, and men whose names had become dates in other families' Bibles. Silas did not know yet who T. H. Mallory was. She only knew enough not to touch the ribbon with dirty fingers. She set the case beside the coins and wiped her hands before lifting the ledger. The ledger's cover was cracked but sound. On the first page, in brown-black ink, someone had written Hollow Branch Mill accounts. 1909. The columns began with ordinary business. Names, bushels, toll, payment, balance. She turned pages slowly. Farmers' names repeated across seasons. McCarter, Reagan, Ogle, Shields, Husky, Ownby, Whaley. Some paid in coin. Some paid in eggs, labor, fence rails, cured pork, sorghum, or nothing that year. Then, beginning in 1930, the entries changed. A line appeared through balances. Beside them, in careful script, one word repeated, forgiven. Not paid. Not transferred. Not settled. Forgiven. Widowell. McCarter, for boo. Meal. Balance forgiven. J. Ogle. Winter account. Forgiven. E. Shields. Drought year. Forgiven. M. Reagan. Husband sick. Forgiven. Husky boys. Corn ground no toll. A. Ownby. Shoes for children. No charge. B. Whaley. Debt erased. Christmas week. The handwriting remained steady through page after page, but Silas saw the pressure change. In some places the pen had dug hard enough to leave grooves. In others, the ink thinned as though the writer had paused too long before dipping again. She understood then that the coins had not been merely hidden wealth. They had been withheld from the world differently than Nolan withheld things. Not to control. Not to punish. Perhaps to protect something from banks, taxes, panic, or kin with clean fingernails and hungry signatures. Perhaps because the miller had chosen, again and again, to let poor families leave with meal and no debt following them home. Silas opened one of the folded receipts. It was from a feed company, another from a doctor, another from a coffin maker in Sevierville, paid in full. Names matched ledger entries. The mill had been more than trade. It had been a place where survival was recorded in ink and then, deliberately, released. The sealed envelope remained. Her name was not on it. No name was. Across the front, in the same careful hand, were the words, "For the one who opens the stone." Silas held it for a long while. The room had gone almost golden with late afternoon light. Dust moved above the table. Outside, water spoke over the low stones where the raceway met the creek. The coins lay in their columns, improbable and quiet. The tools rested beside them. The metal's ribbon had curled slightly where age had tightened it. She could have opened the envelope then. Instead, she placed it back in the tin box. There are moments when knowledge arrives carrying more than a body can hold in one day. She had learned hunger's arithmetic. Floor sounds, chimney soot, hidden carpentry, and the weight of gold before supper. The letter could wait until morning. It had waited longer than she had been alive. She wrapped the coins again in their papers, returned them to the leather pouches, and placed the pouches inside the copper sleeve for the night. Then she thought better of it and removed them, setting them in the canvas bag beneath her coat. She put the ledger and metal in the tin box, the envelope on top, and tied the box shut with the old cord from the first package. The heirloom tools she laid in a row on the table, handles facing the same direction. Before dark, she went outside. She walked past the wheel, along the creek bank, and stopped where the old raceway took water from the main channel. The diversion stones had settled crooked, and water slipped through the broken places with a soft, persistent force. She sat on a flat rock with her hands empty for the first time in hours. The sky above the hollow had cleared to a pale evening blue. High branches of the walnut trees moved without hurry. A few early insects gathered over the creek, rising and falling in a loose column. Somewhere toward the road, the McCarter dog barked once, then twice, then accepted whatever answer the world gave him. Silas watched the water. It came from ridges she could not see, from springs under laurel, from rain held in moss, from small tributaries that had no names on maps. It moved past stone, root, rust, and rot. It did not know about deeds. It did not know about hunger. It did not know the difference between a girl with no address and a miller with gold hidden under cedar. Yet it knew the channel. It found the old cut and entered it still. Behind her, inside the mill, the unopened letter lay in its tin box. The coins waited in the canvas bag beneath her coat. The tools, long sealed away, cooled on the table in the last light as if they had only been set down yesterday. The mill had been waiting. Rain began before daylight, not hard enough to frighten the roof, only steady enough to make every weak place confess. Silas woke to the sound of water-finding pans she had set beneath known leaks and finding 2, 3 she had missed. One drop struck the floor near the counter. Another fell into the half-barrel by the front door with a hollow wooden note. A third had gathered along the window frame and traveled down the wall in a dark line, slow as a finger-tracing damage. She rose from the floor and fed the stove with 2 cedar splits shaved thin at the edge. The chimney drew cleanly after its first gray hesitation. Smoke climbed. The pipe ticked, and the back room began to lose the night from its corners. She warmed creek water, washed her hands with cold soap until the soot lines softened, then dried them on the inside of her coat because the handkerchief was too precious to blacken further. The tin box waited on the table. She had set it squarely in the middle before sleeping, as though placement could make readiness. The old cord still held it closed. Beside it lay the tools from the first package, their handles turned toward her in a line, patient and almost formal. The metal case sat slightly apart. The ledger lay beneath the envelope, brown cloth around it, carrying all those names and forgiven sums like seeds in a dry pod. Silas did not open the box at once. She went first to the front room, checked the cedar disc over the millstone cavity, and made certain the hidden sleeve sat covered. She reset the oak plug and brushed dust over the seam, not to deceive anyone with skill, but to quiet her own fear of exposure. Then she returned to the back room and lit the oil lamp, though morning had come. The lamp flame made the handwriting on the envelope turn warmer. For the one who opens the stone. She knew that hand now from the ledger, but seeing it alone, free of columns and balances, changed it. The letters leaned forward slightly. The capital F had a long top stroke. The O in one was nearly closed. The final E in stone lifted at the end, as if the writer had paused there and not known whether to continue. Silas touched the envelope with 2 fingers. Not her mother's hand. Not Asa's. Not Daniel's. Yet the care in it reached toward the same part of her that had once watched Ruth write grocery amounts, and Asa label jars of screws, and Daniel mark a board twice before cutting. There are families of blood. There are also families of exactness. The seal had dried to a dull brown. She slid the pocket knife under the flap and worked slowly, lifting the paper without tearing it. Inside were 6 sheets folded in thirds along creases so set they opened like memory. The paper had yellowed but remained strong. Lavender had once been pressed between the pages, only its faint ghost remained. Silas sat on the cot frame, set both feet flat on the floor, and began. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the stone has opened beneath your hands, and the mill has not been taken entirely by weather, fire, or men who believe a thing is worthless because it is no longer earning its keep. I do not know your name. I do not know whether you are kin by blood, by work, or by the strange mercy that brings a person to a door no one else wanted. But I am writing to you as plainly as I know how, because plainness is the last kindness I can manage. My name is Eliza Jane Mallory-Whitaker. I was born in 1879 near Ware Cove, Tennessee, and I am writing this on October 14, 1939, after returning from Knoxville, where Dr. Samuel Keene at Fort Sanders Hospital told me the trouble in my breast has moved beyond his knife. He spoke gently. I thanked him. Then I came home by train, walked from Sevierville in my Sunday shoes, and ground Mr. McCarter's corn before dark because he had 6 children and no patience left in his house. This mill came first through my mother's line. My great-grandfather, Josiah Mallory, came down from Rockbridge County, Virginia, in 1808 with a wagon, 2 mill irons, and a Bible wrapped in oilcloth. His son, Abram Mallory, born 1812, built the first race here in 1841 with Cherokee stonecutters who knew more about water than any surveyor he could have hired. Abram's daughter, Ruthanna Mallory, Born 1846. Kept the accounts during the war years when men were gone and women brought grain with faces gray from waiting. Her son Thomas Hiram Mallory. My father, born 1869. Rebuilt the wheel in 1897 after the flood and taught me to dress stone, set timber, and read a man's hunger without making him speak of it. I married Nathaniel Whitaker in 1902. He was a joiner from Blount County, careful with hinges, gentle with horses, and stubborn in the manner of a man who measured twice because he respected wood enough not to blame it for his own haste. Our son, Daniel Thomas, lived 9 years. Fever took him in August of 1913. My younger brother Thomas Hiram Mallory, whose medal you have found, went to France with the American Expeditionary Forces and did not come home. The telegram reached us on November 26, 1918, 2 weeks after church bells rang for the armistice. Grief has poor timing. The trade began closing here on May 7, 1904, though no one knew it that day. The little pigeon rose after 4 days of rain and tore out half the lower race, split the east sill, and carried 3 neighbors' barns into the bends below. We rebuilt because there was no choice. Then came roads, roller mills, store flour in printed sacks, banks that preferred paper to handshakes, and young people who did not wish to stand ankle-deep in meal dust for the wages of patience. By 1931, the toll no longer fed the place. By 1936, I had stopped pretending the books would recover. By 1939, I have kept more than 30 years of silence about what is hidden here, because silence can be a kind of lock when speaking would invite the wrong hands. The coins are not treasure in the storybook sense. Some came from my father's tobacco sales, some from Nathaniel's joinery, some from tolls honestly kept before the hard years. Some were paid by men who later needed their debts forgiven, and so I returned their mercy by erasing the ink instead of returning the coin to men who would have refused it from pride. Use them carefully. Spend as little as repairs require. Leave the rest for the next hand that comes frightened and empty. If you mean to restore the mill or any honest part of it, remember the following. Redress the stones only when they are dry and warm above freezing, never when damp has settled into the bed. Keep the furrows open 1/8 inch at the skirt, feathering to a 1/16 toward the eye. Do not strike straight down with the bill. Let the pick glance and lift. Corn wants a cooler stone than wheat. If the meal smells scorched, slow the feed or raise the runner by 1/4 turn. For mortar in the foundation, do not use hard Portland alone. It will crack the old stone. Use 1 part hydraulic lime, 2 parts sharp sand, and a small handful of fire clay where heat touches chimney brick. Keep new mortar damp under cloth for 3 days in mild weather and longer if the nights fall below 40 degrees. For timber, white oak takes weight, chestnut takes weather if you can find any sound salvage, and poplar will serve for siding if you paint its end grain. Pegs should be riven, not sawn, so they swell true. Boil linseed oil only outdoors and never leave the rags folded. They will burn a house while you are thanking God for warmth. If you reset any gear teeth, mark the old pattern first. Machines remember timing the way hymns remember breath. I have thought long about inheritance. People speak as if it is land, money, silver, a name on a deed, a box put away in a drawer. But the truest inheritance I know is permission. Permission to begin with ruined things. Permission to be clumsy while learning. Permission to keep what was useful and release what was cruel. If you are reading this after being cast off, cheated, widowed, orphaned, tired, or made to feel excess to the world's requirements, then let this house answer without speech. You are not excess here. I ask only 3 things. Feed no greed with what you find. Shame no poor person with help. Write down what you learn, because silence kept me safe, but it also made the road harder for you. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eliza Jane Mallory-Whitaker, Hollow Branch Mill. October 14, 1939. Silas reached the signature and did not move. The rain worked steadily at the roof. The little stove breathed heat against her shins. Somewhere in the front room, a drop struck metal with the same interval as before, but she no longer heard it as damage only. It became a clock of sorts, marking the space between what had been withheld and what had at last been placed in her hands. She read the letter again. The second reading was slower. She stopped at the names and spoke them quietly, not as performance, but to let the room have them back. Josiah, Abram, Ruth Anna, Thomas Hiram, Eliza Jane, Nathaniel, Daniel Thomas. The names made a line across the page, but not a straight one. More like creek water, bending where stone insisted, continuing where earth allowed. At the sentence about permission, her thumb remained on the paper until the warmth of her skin softened it. When she finished the second time, she folded the sheets along their original creases. Not new folds. Not convenient ones. The old lines accepted the paper, and she accepted the old lines. She placed the letter back in the envelope without sealing it, then set it on top of the ledger. Her hands had begun to shake, but not strongly. Only enough that the brass latch of the tin box clicked once against the table when she tried to close it. She stopped, pressed both palms flat, and waited until the shaking became part of her, no longer a thing to fight. Then she stood. The letter had mentioned no map directly, but memory sometimes marks a place by what it chooses not to describe. She took the copied plat from Mrs. Blevins, the yellowed tax lines, and compared them with the view through the rear door. Foundation. Creek. Race. Well path. Walnut cluster. One small X had been penciled near the uphill side of the lane, so faded she had overlooked it before. Beside it, in a hand different from the clerk's copy, were 3 letters, HWT. Horseshoe Walnut Tree. Silas put on her coat and went out through the back door. The rain had eased into mist. Ferns along the bank carried silver beads. The ground gave beneath her shoes, dark and slick from the steady wet. She climbed the short slope toward the 3 walnut trees, using roots for footholds. From the road they had looked like one group. From below, each revealed its own age and posture. The first tree was split at the crown, one leader gone and healed over in a raised lip. The second leaned toward the lane, its lower branch scarred where a chain had once bitten into it. The third was the largest, with a trunk broad enough that Silas could not have reached around it with both arms. Moss grew on the north side. Near shoulder height, half swallowed by bark, was an iron horseshoe. Time had drawn the tree around it. Only the lower curve and one nailhead showed clearly. The rest had disappeared into living wood, held not as ornament but as witness. Rust had stained the bark in 2 narrow trails. Beneath the shoe, someone had carved a small wheel within a circle. The mark had nearly closed as the tree grew, but it remained visible if a person looked with patience. Silas placed her palm against the trunk. The bark was wet and cold. Through it, she felt no message, no storybook pulse, no voice from the dead. Only roughness. Only a living tree that had spent decades doing one thing with complete attention. Growing around what had been given to it. Keeping the iron without becoming iron. At the base of the tree lay old hulls, black and soft, and a few pale roots exposed where rain had washed soil downhill. She did not dig. The letter had not asked it. The mark was enough for one morning. She returned to the mill carrying no object, which made the finding cleaner. Inside, the fire had lowered to coals. The back room smelled of damp wool, soot, and the faint sweetness of warming cedar from the tools laid near the stove. She opened the tin box again and found beneath the metal case a smaller object she had not noticed the day before because the ledger cloth had hidden it. A candle. It was wrapped in waxed paper, its surface yellowed and faintly cracked. A note around the wick read, Christmas Eve, 1879. Poured by Ruth Anna. Kept for dark need. Silas held it with both hands. The wick had been trimmed but never lit. The candle was not beautiful. It leaned slightly to one side and bore the mark of a mold seam. Yet there was something almost unbearable in its survival. A column of wax carried through births, funerals, floods, war, illness, closed doors, and decades of mice and dust, all to wait for a dark need no one could name in advance. She set it in the cracked mug on the table, wedging it upright with 3 clean pebbles from the creek. Then she took a match from the packet mister. Hargett had given her without charging for it. She struck once. The match flared sulphurous and brief. The old wick resisted, then caught. A small flame rose, blue at the base, gold above, bending toward the draft from the broken window before steadying itself. Silas sat before it. The lamp had been brighter, the stove warmer, the morning clearer, but the candle changed the room differently. It placed one careful circle of light on the table, touching the letter, the chisel handles, the ledger's cracked cover, and the edge of the metal case. The flame moved over them without choosing among them. She thought then of the chain that had brought her there, each link too modest to call destiny. The bus driver with silver hair who had stopped where no stop was marked. Mrs. Blevins, who had warned her plainly and given her the copied plat. Emmett Hargett, who had opened a credit account without asking her to perform gratitude. The woman at the library who had cleared her throat by the copy machine, making Silas step aside and then return, placing her eyes a second time on the notice she might have missed. Small kindnesses did not announce themselves as rescue. They arrived as a door held open, a map folded twice, a booklet with mouse-bitten corners, a bus stopping in the wrong place. They did not erase hunger or grief. They did not restore a farm, resurrect a mother, return stolen tools, or make a ruined roof whole. But they placed one plank over the next inch of water. And sometimes an inch was the whole distance between sinking and crossing. If you are listening to this in the quiet of your own evening, perhaps there is a kindness you still remember because it was small enough to be believable. A neighbor who brought soup and did not stay too long. A clerk who explained the form twice. A stranger who waited while you counted change. A hand on a gate. A ride in bad weather. Tell us about that kindness in the comments, if you are willing. Not the grand kind. The kind that kept you for one more day. Silas watched the candle until a bead of wax traveled down one side and cooled against the mug. The rain stopped near noon. After it ended, the mill grew louder for a time, not with machines, but with dripping eaves, swollen creek water, and the soft release of wet leaves outside. Silas used that ordinary noise to begin putting the discovered things in safer order. She wrapped the coins and returned them to the leather pouches, then placed the pouches in the tin box beneath the ledger. She left the appraisal slip folded inside the first pouch because money without record became rumor too quickly. She set the metal case atop the letter, not hidden, not displayed. The tools she cleaned lightly with a dry cloth. No oil yet. No sharpening. She knew enough not to improve what she had not studied. The chisels had bevels shaped by another hand, and she did not want to erase that hand in the name of care. One handle bore a shallow burn mark near the ferrule. Another had a crack bound with thread blackened by use. The little dresser's pick balanced strangely in her palm, heavier in the head than she expected, eager toward stone. She brought the heirloom tools to the cot frame that evening. There was no mattress, no pillow except the canvas bag, no proper blanket except her coat. Still, she arranged the objects beside her with the seriousness of a person setting places at a table. The plumb bob near her right hand. The bent nail near the bag pocket. The letter inside the tin box close enough that she could touch the lid. Ruth's gloves folded beneath her cheek. The old chisels wrapped again but not put away. The candle, burned only an inch, cooled in the cracked mug on the table. Dark gathered slowly. The front room became a deeper shape beyond the doorway. The millstones disappeared first at their edges, then entirely, though she knew now that darkness did not make them empty. The creek went on speaking below the wall. The stove held a red eye in its ash, then closed it. Silas lay on her back and looked toward the rafters she could not see. She did not make plans that night. Plans required numbers. Permits, roofs, food, weather, and strength she had not yet counted. She did not decide what to spend, whom to trust, or how to answer the county. She only let the sentence from the letter stand in the room without argument. "You are not excess here." A mouse moved near the counter, then retreated. Wind crossed the broken upper window and passed through the mill's ribs without finding her. For the first time since her mother's funeral, Silas slept before exhaustion forced her under. The heirlooms rested beside her. Neither burden nor proof, simply kept. The first snow came on December 3, soft at the beginning and then deliberate enough to measure. By noon, 2.5 inches lay along the walnut branches and gathered in the broken places of the lane. It did not cover the damage so much as reveal it. Snow entered through the opened ridge of the roof, fell in a narrow white line across the front room, and settled on the millstone cover like flour sifted by a careless hand. A second drift gathered beside the counter where the tin had pulled loose. In the back room, one pale finger of snow reached through a seam near the chimney and lay across the table until the stove's heat softened it into drops. Silas stood under the worst of the leak with her notebook in her hand and did not curse the roof. It had held longer than anyone had thanked it for. That evening, she read the roofing chapter in Mr. Hargett's old repair booklet 3 times. The first reading was for fear. The second was for words. The third was for sequence. She copied the diagrams by stovelight, drawing rafters, sheathing, underlayment, flashing, drip edge, shingle exposure, nail placement. The booklet assumed more confidence than she possessed, but it did not flatter the work. That helped. It said a roof failed first at ignorance, second at haste, and third at pride. She began measuring before buying anything. The mill roof was not a clean rectangle. The creek side sagged. The uphill side had been patched in 2 different generations, and the chimney interrupted the slope where a careless repair had once trapped water against brick. She made measurements with mason's twine, a yardstick, and the plumb bob line when the wind allowed it, 26 feet along the ridge, 14 feet from ridge to eave on the front slope. Nearer 13.5 at the rear because the building had settled out a square. Overhangs uneven. Tin sheets rusted beyond reuse along the lower third. She drew the roof as it was. Not as a roof ought to be. then calculated waste because age had already taken its share. At Hargett Hardware, she asked for the least expensive materials that would keep water out without pretending to be permanent forever. Mr. Hargett leaned over her drawing, used a carpenter's pencil to correct the waste calculation, and said she would need 12 bundles of 3-tab asphalt shingles if she patched both slopes from the ridge down past the worst failures, 2 rolls of 15-pound felt, 1 box of 1 1/4-inch roofing nails, 6 sticks of drip edge, a tube of roof cement, 2 step flashing packs, and more patience than the manufacturer sold. She looked at the numbers and grew quiet. He let her be quiet. Then he went into the back room and returned carrying a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle and a gauge notch worn bright from use. The head was clean, the claw narrow, the cutting edge freshly dressed. He set it on the counter between them. "Belonged to my wife's brother," he said. "He roofed barns until his knees went bad. Silas did not touch it. I cannot buy that. I did not price it. That makes... I expect so." The hatchet lay there, plain as a fact. Mr. Hargett wrote nothing in the ledger for it. After a moment, Silas lifted it and felt the old balance settle in her hand. Tools had memory, not in any magical sense, but in their wear. The handle told her where another thumb had rested. The head told her what angle had struck straight for years. "You will return it," he said, "or you will wear it honestly." "Yes." "Sir." "Either one will do." The next morning, a man came down the lane carrying a ladder over one shoulder. He was introduced by no one. Silas heard the ladder first, aluminum knocking against brush, then saw him appear between the walnut trees in a brown canvas coat and rubber boots. He was thin, tall, and folded somewhat forward from the spine, as if years on roof pitches had taught him to lean into the world before it leaned into him. His hair was white under a cap with the name of a roofing company long out of business. A cigarette rested unlit behind one ear. "Name's Hollis Pike," he said. "Emmett said you had a roof that was telling the truth." Silas stood on the porch with the hatchet in her hand. "I cannot pay much." "I did not ask much. I cannot pay little either." He looked past her toward the roofline. "I said nothing about pay." That ended the matter for him, though not for her. Hollis would not take money. He would not take coffee because she had none. He accepted 1 boiled potato on the 4th day and a sharpened pencil on the 7th because he said short pencils hid from old hands. His teaching style was mostly weather, silence, and correction. They worked 11 days. Not 11 full days, because winter light was brief and frost made the roof slick before mid-morning. They began when the shingles softened enough not to crack under their knees, and stopped when shadows from the hill crossed the ridge. Hollis insisted on staging first. No ladder set in mud. No weight on untested decking. No tool laid where it could slide into water or skull. He showed her how to tie a rope around the chimney base, how to keep 3 points of contact, how to climb with nothing in the hand that could be hauled after. The first day was assessment. The second was stripping the failed tin and rotten patchwork. The third uncovered the worst rafter, cracked near the ridge and softened where water had entered for years. Hollis tapped it once with the hatchet and shook his head. "Sister rafter," he said. She knew the phrase from the booklet, but not the feel of the work. They cut a new length of 2x6, not new in truth, but salvage from a collapsed shed Mr. Hargett knew of and judged sound. The sister rafter had to run well past the damaged span, bearing on solid wood at both ends. Hollis made her dry fit it twice. Clamp it. Check the crown, then bore pilot holes to avoid splitting the aged timber. They fastened it with structural screws Emmett had reluctantly charged at cost, and 2 carriage bolts where access allowed. "Flush," Hollis said. She adjusted. Not proud. She tightened another quarter turn. "That'll hold." It was the longest praise he gave. For the roof plane, he snapped a chalk line across the new felt, blue dust jumping against the cold air. He made her stand back and look along it. "A roof is lines," he said. "Water follows lies." They worked from the eave upward, setting the first course with care because every course above would repeat its error or its honesty. Hollis taught the 3-stroke nail, set, seat, stop. 1 tap to place, 1 to drive, 1 to finish flush without cutting the shingle. When Silas struck too lightly, he said, again, when she struck too hard, he said, "You bought the nail, not the sky." When a nail stood high enough to lift a shingle, he pointed with 2 fingers. "That nail's proud." She pulled it. By the 6th day, her knees were bruised through her jeans. By the 8th, her right wrist ached from the hatchet and hammer, and she could no longer feel her toes until she climbed down and walked circles beside the creek. Hollis showed no sympathy, but when she was not looking, he moved the bundles closer to the ladder so she carried them shorter distances. On the 9th day, wind came down the hollow hard enough to lift the felt before they could fasten it, and he made them stop without apology. "Roof wants to live," he said. "Wind wants to teach." On the 11th day, near mid-December, they set the final ridge cap under a sky the color of clean pewter. Hollis climbed down first and stood in the lane, looking up. Silas came after, slow from stiffness, the hatchet hanging at her side. The roof was not beautiful. The new shingles covered only what they had been able to afford and reach, and the older sound portions still showed their age. The chimney flashing was temporary but clean. The ridge no longer open to snow. Water would have to work harder now. Hollis took the cigarette from behind his ear, looked at it, then put it in his coat pocket unlit. "Good enough for winter," he said. Silas looked at the roof until the shape of it entered her body as something completed, modest and real. That night, snow slid down the new shingles instead of entering the room. January showed her what the roof had been protecting. Once the leaks slowed, the chimney damage became impossible to ignore. The lower stones were sound enough, dark with age and soot but not moving under hand pressure. The trouble began where old brick had been stacked above the original stonework in some later repair, likely when a taller flue had been needed for a stove different from the first one. Those bricks had spalled from freeze and heat. Their faces had popped loose in red flakes. In the joints, mortar had turned to pale powder that came away under the point of a nail. When wind struck from the north, fine grit fell into the stovepipe. Silas laid newspaper beneath the thimble and found it dusted by morning. She returned to the repair booklet, then to Mr. Hargett's counter, where he listened to her describe the bricks and made a face as if tasting bad coffee. "Do not smear cement over it and call that masonry," he said. "No, sir. Portland will be harder than the old brick. Harder is not kinder." He sold her a small sack of hydraulic lime, a coffee can of fire clay from his back shelf, and sharp sand kept under a tarp behind the store. The mix, he said, should be 2 parts sand, 1 part lime, with fire clay added where the heat was direct, not enough to make the joints brittle. For the hottest portion near the stovepipe collar, he advised 1 part lime, 1 part fire clay, 2 parts sand. Mix stiff. Pressed deep, cured slow. He drew the joint profile on brown wrapping paper and made her copy it. "No big pretty smears," he said. "Pack the joint. Tool it. Let it breathe. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that held mostly in the 20s. She set the stove low each morning, just enough to keep her fingers from becoming useless, then let the brick cool before touching the repair area. She raked out failed mortar with a bent screwdriver and the narrow cold chisel, working no deeper than the joint allowed, stopping whenever a brick shifted under pressure. Dust fell into her hair, along her sleeves, into the creases beside her eyes. She brushed every open joint with an old paintbrush mister Hargett had given her, then misted it lightly with boiled and cooled water so the dry brick would not steal moisture too fast from the new mortar. Every 15 minutes, her bare hands went numb. Gloves were clumsy for joint work, and wet lime found the smallest tear in skin. She learned to work until the feeling left her fingertips, then step outside and tuck her hands beneath her arms while walking to the creek and back. The cold did not hurt at first. That was the danger. Then feeling returned as pain, a bright needlework under each nail. She accepted it as information. Not punishment. Information. She mixed mortar in the cracked enamel basin, measuring with a tin cup 2 cups sharp sand, 1 cup lime, a ½ cup fire clay for the warmer joints. Dry mix first until the color evened. Water by spoonfuls. Too wet and it slumped. Too dry and it would not pack. The proper mix held on the trowel, heavy and reluctant, like biscuit dough made by someone with strong hands. There was no romance in repointing. It was slow, close, gray work. Press, fill, compact, strike off. Press again. Tool the joint concave with the rounded back of the spoon she had sacrificed to the task. Wipe the brick face before the lime smeared white. Cover the fresh work with damp cloth. Keep it from freezing. Check it at night. Check it again in the morning. On one bitter afternoon, sleet ticked against the new roof while Silas worked by lamplight, her breath showing in the room despite the banked stove. She had repaired 6 courses, and still the damaged area seemed nearly the same size. The chimney offered no encouragement. It simply accepted what was done correctly and exposed what was not. By the second week, she could hear the difference when tapping a joint. Powdered mortar gave a dry whisper. Fresh packed lime answered dull and firm. By the third week, the collar around the pipe no longer shifted. The brick stack, though aged and uneven, stood with less complaint. The test fire came late January, after 3 days of curing with the stove cold. Silas waited for a morning above freezing. It reached 34 degrees by noon, and pale sun entered the front room through the upper broken window. She opened the stove door, laid cedar shavings, then 2 small splits, then 1 oak piece no thicker than her wrist. She set the match, closed the door, and watched. Smoke rose. She went outside quickly, boots slipping in old snow along the back path. At first the chimney gave a weak gray ribbon. Then the draft strengthened. Smoke lifted straight from the repaired stack and moved clean into the winter air. No side seepage, no coughing from joints, no black backwash into the room. She stood in the yard with her hands in her coat pockets and watched until her face grew cold. Inside, the stove warmed as if nothing in the world had ever been broken. The floors began as a matter of safety and became, slowly, a matter of mercy. White pine planks ran through most of the back room and along the safer paths of the front, some nearly 16 inches wide, hand-planed long ago and fastened with rosehead nails, whose hammered tops had darkened to black dots in the grain. Many boards were sound beneath the dirt. Others had lifted at the ends. A few near the gear pit had softened enough that her heel left a shallow dent. She marked the dangerous ones with chalk and refused to pretend that a swept room was the same as a safe one. "Mister, Hargett knew a man with salvaged white pine from a torn-down smokehouse. Hollis Pike hauled 6 planks in the back of his nephew's truck and left before Silas could thank him twice. The boards were weathered on one side, clean enough on the other after planing, and close in age to the mill's own wood. She measured thickness, matched width where she could, and cut patches by hand because power tools cost money in ways that did not always show on the receipt. The rosehead nails were another matter. New bright nails would have held, but they would have looked like lies in the floor. Mr. Hargett found a coffee can of cut nails on a lower shelf. The label gone, the heads irregular and dark. He weighed them in his palm, then charged her a sum so low she knew not to insult him by objecting. She pre-drilled each hole with an awl to prevent splitting, set the nails with the roofing hatchet's flat face, and finished with a nail set made from a blunted punch. The bad boards came up reluctantly. Some cracked. Some released whole with a sound like a joint popping. Beneath them she found dust, mouse tunnels, old grain, 2 buttons, a corroded penny, and a strip of newspaper from 1942 advertising coffee, sugar, and war bonds. She saved the newspaper between pages of the repair booklet, not because it was useful, but because someone's ordinary day had slipped beneath the floor and waited there. When the patches were in, she rented a random orbit sander from Hargett Hardware for $14 a day. Mr. Hargett made her sign a rental card and then stood over the machine as if introducing a difficult animal. Do not lean on it. Let the grit work. Keep it moving. Dust bag emptied before it chokes. Yes, sir. Start with 80. Then 120. Then 220 if the floor earns it. The sander rattled her arms until her teeth felt loose. She worked in sections, moving every nail, stone, and tool out of the path. 80 grit first, taking off grime, splinters, raised edges, and the gray film of decades. The room filled with pine dust so fragrant that it seemed impossible such sweetness had been hidden under dirt. She wore the handkerchief over her mouth and opened both doors despite the cold. Dust settled on the stove, the bench, her eyelashes, the cot frame. 120 grit changed the boards from clean to touched. The old pine began to show its grain again, long amber lines and knots shaped like weather eyes. The patches remained visible, as they should. Newer salvage beside older planks, one survival beside another. She did not try to erase the difference. 220 grit was slower and almost tender. By then she had learned the machine's pull and could guide it without fighting. Late light moved across the boards and revealed a surface not perfect, but continuous. She knelt and ran her palm along the grain. No splinter rose to bite. For finish, she used tung oil cut for the first coat and boiled linseed oil for the second and third, following warnings with almost fearful care. Thin coats. No puddles. Rag laid flat outside over stone. Never folded. Never left near heat. 48 hours between coats when the weather allowed. The first coat darkened the pine to honey. The second deepened it toward old amber. The third brought out a reddish-brown glow in certain boards, mahogany in the knots and edges, as if the floor had been holding warmth in reserve. The curing days tested her patience more than labor did. She had to walk on boards laid as paths and avoid finished sections like a person moving through a church after candles had been lit. The room smelled of oil, pine, cold air, and restraint. She slept in the front room for 2 nights while the back floor cured, wrapped in her coat near the millstones, listening to the stove cool beyond the doorway. Then came the bad morning. It arrived with no dramatic cause. The roof held. The chimney drew. The floor shone in the slant winter light. She had food enough for that day and a list of tasks clear enough to begin. Yet when she bent to lift the sander for return, her arms simply did not rise. Not from weakness alone. From all the mornings before it, stacked inside one body. Hay barn cold. Truck sleep. Funeral paper. Chimney soot. Roof bruises. The ledger of forgiven debts. The letter's permission. The work ahead. She set the sander down. For a while she stood in the room while dust motes moved through the light. Then she put on her coat, took no tools, and walked past the creek, past the lower bend, into a marshy clearing where winter grass lay flattened under frost and thaw. There was open water there, shallow and still between reeds. A great blue heron stood near the far edge. One leg hidden, neck folded into the shape of ancient patience. Silas sat on a fallen log. She did not work that day. The heron did not perform beauty for her. It waited. When it moved, the motion was so slow it seemed drawn out of the world rather than imposed upon it. Its foot entered the water without ripple. Its beak lowered. It struck once, lifted a small silver fish, and swallowed. Clouds moved over the mountain. The cold entered her sleeves and stayed. She remained until afternoon, doing nothing that could be measured, billed, repaired, photographed, or reported to the county. Then she returned to the mill, washed her hands, ate a boiled potato with salt, and slept before dark. The next morning, the floor was ready beneath her feet. The mill had been waiting. February gave her the windows one by one, each with its own temperament. There were 8 in all. 3 had no glass remaining, only sash frames with points of old putty clinging like dry bone. 4 were cracked across the pane, the fractures making pale lightning when morning light entered. 1, in the upper front room above the millstones, still held original wavy glass marked by bubbles and faint distortions that bent the creekside trees when viewed through it. Someone had scratched a date into the lower rail below that window. 1788. Silas did not know whether the sash truly reached back that far, or whether a later hand had carved an older memory into it. Either way, she refused to replace it. Mr. Hargett sold her DAP 33 glazing putty from a can with a metal lid dented on one side. He made her buy a proper putty knife instead of ruining the kitchen knife she did not own. For glass, he sent her to a man behind the feed store who cut panes from salvaged storm windows at $1 each if she did not complain about slight waves, tint, or scratches. She did not complain. Scratches belonged to the family of use. Removing old putty required more patience than strength. She set each sash flat on the workbench when she could remove it, and worked in place when paint, swelling, or age refused her. The old glazing came away in flakes after gentle heat from a borrowed lamp and careful pressure from the knife. Too much force would break the muntins. Too little would do nothing. She learned the angle by failing in harmless places first, then carried the knowledge to the narrow bars where the wood had dried thin. The bare rabbits she brushed clean, then primed lightly with oil so the dry wood would not drink from the new putty too quickly. She pressed a thin bedding layer into place, set the glass, and installed glazier's points with the flat of the putty knife. The first point bent. The second vanished onto the floor and took 10 minutes to find. By the 4th window, she could seat them with a firm push and no wasted breath. The putty itself had to be warmed in the hand. Cold putty tore and dragged. Warm putty obeyed. She rolled it into cords between her palms, pressed it along the edge, then drew the knife in one clean line, angled so water would shed outward. Her first line wavered. Her second was worse because she tried too hard. By the third sash, she learned to move steadily and stop before fussing ruined the surface. Putty, like grief, showed every place a person could not leave well enough alone. The sash cords were rotten in 6 windows. She bought 1/4-inch cotton sash cord from Hargett Hardware, soft but strong. And Mr. Hargett made her practice the knot on a counterweight he kept under the counter for teaching. Feed the cord through the pulley. Tie a figure-8 knot at the weight, tight enough not to slip, bulky enough not to pull through. Ease the iron weight back into its pocket. Do not let it drop. Do not put your fingers where gravity has an opinion. The first counterweight startled her with its heaviness. It hung hidden inside the wall like a secret muscle, making the window possible. She cleaned each pulley with a rag, worked a little oil into the axle, then raised and lowered the sash until the motion smoothed. When a repaired window stayed open on its own for the first time, she stood before it longer than needed, watching air enter without violence. The original upper window she treated differently. She climbed the ladder with the caution Hollis had beaten into her through silence and correction. The pane was cracked in one corner, but not through the center. The putty had failed along the lower edge, and water had darkened the rail. She scraped only loose material, leaving anything sound. She did not remove the glass. She bedded fresh putty into the missing places with 2 fingers and the smallest knife strokes, working around the old pane as one might work around a sleeping animal. Through that wavy glass, the world looked handmade. The walnut trees bowed in strange lines. The creek seemed nearer than it was. The lane lifted and lowered like breath. Silas thought of all the eyes that had looked through that pane, watching wagons arrive, storms gather, children run toward water, men carry sacks, women wait with shawls tight around their shoulders. A window did not remember in words. It held distortions faithfully. By the final week of February, 7 windows were tight enough against weather to count as victory. The last was in the back room above the table. Its lower sash had been painted shut long before abandonment, and the upper sash had dropped crooked in its track. One pane was missing. Another had a crack from corner to corner. The cord on the left side had snapped and disappeared inside the pocket with its weight. Silas saved it for last because she knew it would resist her and because the table beneath it had become the place where she kept the letter when reading. She began after breakfast with the stove low and a gray sky outside. First the paint line, scored with the knife. Then gentle pressure from 2 thin wedges. Then more scoring. Then waiting. She had learned by then that force often meant the worker had run out of understanding. At last the sash lifted a 1/4 inch with a sigh that released a smell of old paint and cold wood. She removed the stop bead without breaking it, which felt like a private ceremony. The pocket cover came loose after 3 rusted screws surrendered to oil and patience. Inside, the iron counterweight lay at the bottom of the cavity, still tied to a frayed cord end. She fished it out with wire, cleaned it, tied the new 1/4 inch cotton cord with a figure-8 knot, then threaded the cord over the pulley and attached it to the sash with 2 small screws through the knot cleat. Up, down, test, adjust. The motion dragged once. She found a burr in the track, sanded it smooth, and tried again. The window rose. Not easily. Not like new work. But it rose. She set the salvaged glass pane into fresh bedding putty, pressed points in place, and drew the final bevel with the knife in one unbroken line. Outside, a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch, so close that she could see the black cap of its head and the small, restless turn of its body. It gripped the twig through a passing gust, looked once toward the room, then began working at something hidden in the bark. Silas held still with the putty knife in her hand. The bird remained. Behind her, the floor had cured dark and warm. The chimney stood patched. The roof kept out the weather. The windows, one by one, had begun giving the mill back its eyes. Nothing was finished. The work ahead still outnumbered the work behind. But February light entered differently now, no longer as trespass through broken, but as something admitted. The chickadee flicked its wings and vanished into the walnut branches. Silas lowered the sash until it met the sill, and for the first time since she had arrived, the back room held its own warmth without apology. The plaster announced itself after the windows stopped rattling. Before that, Silas had mistaken the walls for merely stained, cracked, and tired, which they were, but the new stillness in the back room made every failed place more visible. Near the chimney, 3 patches had pulled loose from the hand-split oak lath beneath them. One was the size of a dinner plate. One ran from the stovepipe collar toward the ceiling in a long, uneven tongue. The third had fallen entirely behind the table, leaving exposed lath like thin ribs and revealing the old horsehair mixed through the base coat, dark curls caught in pale lime. She touched the edge of the largest patch with 2 fingers. It gave a hollow answer. The original work had been good. That mattered. The lath had been split, not sawn, leaving rough surfaces that held plaster keys. Each strip was nailed by hand, with uneven gaps that showed a worker judging by eye and experience rather than factory measure. The plaster itself had 3 ages in it: a coarse first coat squeezed between lath, a brown coat carrying sand and hair, and a finish coat rubbed smooth enough that lamplight still found it kindly. The failures were all near the chimney. Heat, moisture, neglect, not mystery. Only time choosing its weak point. Mr. Hargett had a feed sack in the back room of the store marked in pencil, horsehair. 1950s. Clean. It had belonged, he said, to his father, who never threw away anything that might someday keep a wall from falling. The hair inside was dark, springy, and faintly dusty, cut in lengths a few inches long. Silas bought lime, sharp sand, and the smallest amount of plaster she could manage, then carried everything back in 2 trips, stopping halfway each time beside the walnut trees to rest her hands. The repair began with removal. She did not widen the damage from impatience. She tapped gently around each hollow area, marked the loose perimeter with chalk, and cut back only to sound plaster. The failed pieces came down in heavy flakes, striking the floor with soft mineral thuds. She saved 1 section to study the layers and thickness. Scratch coat. Brown coat. Finish. Nothing hidden. Nothing careless. The wall had been made by someone who expected it to last and had nearly been proven right. For the scratch coat, she mixed lime plaster stiff enough to hold on the hawk and worked horsehair through it until the strands disappeared evenly. She dampened the old lath with a brush, waited until the shine left, then pressed the plaster hard through the gaps so it mushroomed behind and formed keys. The first press mattered more than the surface. She scored it with crossing lines from the edge of the putty knife, roughing it so the next coat would have a place to grip. It cured slowly under damp cloth. The brown coat came 3 days later, 3/8 of an inch thick, measured not with a ruler every time, but with the body's growing memory of the trowel. She mixed it less hairy, more sandy, and pressed it flush within a finger's width of the surrounding wall. The booklet said 72 hours. Mr. Hargett said the wall would know if she cheated. She waited. The finish coat was thin, 1/8 inch at most, lime-rich and smooth under the trowel. She feathered the edges into the old surface with a wet brush, not hiding the repair completely, only refusing to make it proud. When the final patch dried, it showed faintly in certain light. A paler island near the chimney, shaped by need and kept within honest borders. Silas stood before it one evening with lime dust on her sleeves and her hands roughened white at the knuckles. "These patches will hold another 100 years," she said. The room accepted the sentence without echo. Doris Bledsoe owned Dolly's kettle, though no one in town called it by its painted name unless they were reading the sign. To locals it was Doris's, and that seemed to settle the matter more firmly than any business license. She was a broad woman in her late 50s, with auburn hair pinned behind both ears, reading glasses always on her head, and flour along one hip of her apron by 9 each morning. Her cafe smelled of biscuits, coffee, bacon grease, lemon cleaner, and the brown paper sacks she folded for takeout orders before the breakfast rush began. Silas had gone in only once at first, to ask if Doris kept cardboard boxes for kindling and storage. She had expected a refusal, or a question, or the careful distance people sometimes kept from visible need. Doris looked her over, turned toward the kitchen, and said, "Empty apple boxes by the back door." After that, paper sacks began appearing on the mill porch. Not every day. That would have made them charity, and Doris had a sharper understanding than that. They came 2 or 3 times a week, usually before Silas woke fully or while she was in town. Inside might be 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a heel of ham, 3 bruised apples, soup in a jar, cornbread ends, or a jar of coffee grounds marked second Brubit descent in thick pencil. Once there was a square of cake with the frosting carefully covered by another scrap of wax paper. Silas carried the first sack back to the cafe and set it on the counter. "I cannot pay for this." Doris did not look up from counting change into a drawer. "I did not send a bill." "I mean it. So do I. I cannot keep taking food." At that, Doris closed the drawer and looked at her through the steam rising from the coffee machine. "Then pay me in candles when the shop reopens." "It is not a shop." Silas looked down at the sack. Warmth had softened the wax paper around the biscuits. The smell rose between them, ordinary and devastating. "I do not make candles." Doris wiped the counter once with a white cloth. "Then learn slow." The next sack arrived 2 mornings later, with beans, a hard roll, and a note saying the jar was to be returned because jars did not grow on trees no matter what men believed. Caleb Pike came by bicycle. He was 16, perhaps 17 by height, but his face had not yet agreed to leave childhood completely. He rode an old red Schwinn with silver fenders, one pedal clicking every rotation and a milk crate wired to the rear rack. His hair fell into his eyes no matter how often he pushed it back. He wore a gray sweatshirt, work boots too large at the toe, and an expression of defensive usefulness. Silas found him at the woodpile on a Saturday morning in March, swinging a splitting maul at rounds Hollis had dropped off without comment. The first round split badly. The maul stuck. Caleb braced one foot against the wood and pulled until the handle came free, then glanced toward the mill and saw her watching. His face reddened. "My granddad said you need kindling." Hollis said that. "He says less than he means." "That seems true." Caleb set another round upright and swung again. This one split clean, 2 halves falling apart with a dry crack. He tried not to look pleased. Silas walked closer. "I can pay a little." "No. Mom, I do not need free labor." "My mother said." "About your grandfather." She waited. He swallowed, then focused on the wood as if the next sentence were easier to say to Oak. "She said Asa fixed our porch steps when I was little. Wouldn't take pay. said children ought not learn falling before walking. Silas looked toward the creek. Caleb split 3 more rounds before speaking again. So I can do Saturdays. Not all day. I got chores. I have chores, too. He nodded, accepting this as a serious answer. After that, he came when weather allowed. He split wood, carried shingles left over from the roof into the dry corner, swept the lane after storms, and once spent 2 hours fishing a dropped sash weight from a wall pocket with wire and stubborn silence. He refused coins. He accepted biscuits from Doris's sacks because, he said, refusing food was foolish unless a person was sick. He never asked about the millstone, the tin box, or why some evenings Silas sat with an old ledger open under lamplight. Reverend Boyd passed each morning at nearly the same time. He was not the preacher from Ruth's funeral, nor from Asa's, but a retired Methodist minister who lived beyond the green-railed bridge and walked for his heart, his doctor, and perhaps his loneliness. He wore a dark felt hat, a long coat brushed thin at the cuffs, and polished shoes that gathered dust along Walden Creek Road, no matter the weather. His face had the gentle gravity of a man who had stood beside many beds and learned not to fill silence with himself. At first he only tipped his hat when passing the walnut trees. Silas would be carrying water, stacking wood, scraping paint, or standing on the porch with a cup of boiled creek water warming her hands. He did not stop. He did not call out advice. He lifted 2 fingers to the brim and continued along the road, step after measured step. On the 9th morning, he paused. The sky was pale, the creek swollen with thaw. Silas stood beside the porch, holding a broken hinge she had just removed from the rear door. Reverend Boyd looked at the mill, then at the hinge, then at the roof patch. "God keep you steady," he said. 4 words. He tipped his hat and went on. After that, the same blessing arrived every morning he saw her. Always in passing, never made heavy by explanation. Sometimes Silas heard it while up the ladder and answered only by lifting one hand. Sometimes she was inside and saw his hat move past the window. Sometimes she missed him altogether and found later, in the mud near the walnut trees, the pared marks of his shoes and cane. His prayer did not repair anything. It did not pay, mister. Hargett, fill the pantry, strengthen the sill beam, or shorten the county's patience. But it placed the day inside a sentence that did not demand proof. Steady. Not safe. Not triumphant. Steady was enough. She postponed the cellar until February 11 because every other task had a louder voice. The roof had leaked. The chimney had powdered. The floors had bitten. The windows had shivered. And the walls had opened their failed plaster near the stove. The cellar waited beneath a trap door in the front room, half hidden under a warped grain sack and a fallen shelf board. She knew of it from the 2nd week, when her broom handle struck the iron pull ring and gave back a hollow knock. She had knelt then, brushed dust away, and decided not yet. Cellars deserved daylight, rope, and a mind not distracted by freezing mortar. On February 11, the morning came clear and windless. Silas set the lantern on the counter, tied a cord around her waist with the other end looped around the millstone railing, then lifted the trap door. It rose heavily, shedding dirt along its edges. Below it, 7 granite steps descended into dark. The air that came up was cold enough to taste. She waited, letting it breathe. Then she lowered the lantern by its handle, watched the flame hold, and went down 1 step at a time. The steps had been cut from granite, worn shallow in the middle by generations of feet. Moisture silvered the outer edges. On the 4th step, She stopped and listened. No movement. Only water somewhere beyond the foundation, slow and underground. The cellar measured 12 by 15 feet, roughly, with a fieldstone floor and walls laid in a mix of stone sizes, some flat and careful, others fitted by persuasion. The ceiling beams were low enough that she had to bow her head. Old shelves lined the uphill wall, mostly collapsed, holding broken jars, 2 stoneware crocks, a rusted barrel hoop, and the papery remains of seed packets. A square of light from the open trap door fell across the middle of the floor and stopped at the edge of a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the rest. The slab was centered in the room, 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, smooth-faced, its edges dressed cleanly. Into its surface someone had carved the same craft mark she had seen on the copper tube and walnut tree, a water wheel inside a circle. 8 spokes, precise and shallow. Dust had settled inside the cuts, making the mark visible only when the lantern light crossed it from the side. Silas stood over it for a long while. Every instinct sharpened. Hidden things had already found her once. A marked stone in the center of a cellar did not ask to be ignored. But the slab was heavy beyond her means, and the surrounding floor showed no sign of recent disturbance, only the long-settled compactness of damp earth and stone. More than that, the letter had taught her something about sequence. Not every closed thing was a refusal. Some were instructions about readiness. She did not lift it. She swept the slab clear with a hand broom, traced the wheel mark once without pressing, and wrote its position in her notebook. Center cellar slab. Dressed granite. Craft mark, do not move alone. On the stairs going up, her left boot struck something under the 3rd step. The sound was wood against stone, small and dry. She lowered herself carefully, held the lantern near the riser, and saw a narrow gap where the back of the 3rd step did not meet the wall. Wedged there, black with dust, was a small oak box. It did not come free at first. She used the bent nail from Asa's shop, working it along one side, then the other, easing the box forward by fractions until it slid into her hand. It was no larger than a Bible, made of oak darkened by age, with a lid that fit without hinges. There was no lock, only a peg latch shaped so finely she almost missed it. Inside lay a brassed key and a tin-type photograph. The key had a long, narrow shaft and a bow shaped like the water wheel mark, 8 small openings around a center hole. The brass had darkened, but where the bow rubbed against the box lining, it still held a muted gold color. It was not for a modern door. It was too deliberate for a trunk, too ornamental for a padlock. She held it up to the lantern, and light passed through the tiny wheel shape, casting a broken circle on the cellar wall. The photograph was wrapped in cloth. Silas unfolded it on the stair because she did not want to take it into the damp before seeing its condition. The image was dark at first, then resolved as she angled it toward the lantern. A young woman stood before the very mill, though it looked straighter, stronger, with a full wheel behind her and siding unwarped by weather. She wore a long dark skirt, a white blouse, and an apron dusted at the front. In her hand she held a stone dresser's pick, the handle angled across her body with the ease of use rather than pose. Her face stopped Silas cold. Not identical. Time, blood, and tin chemistry did not work so simply. But the cheekbones, the narrow chin, the steady mouth, the way one eyebrow sat slightly higher than the other, all seemed to have crossed the years with unreasonable care. It was like seeing a stranger wearing an expression her own face had been practicing without permission. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written Miriam Eliza Mallory. daughter of Abram's line, age 25, summer of 1903. Silas carried the box upstairs slowly. The cellar darkness remained below her, the granite slab unlifted, the craft mark still centered in its quiet room. She closed the trapdoor and laid the photograph, key, and box on the front counter where light from the repaired window could reach them. Dust rose around the objects and settled again. She did not know what the key opened. That ignorance felt different now. Not threatening. Kept. By evening, the brass key sat on the mantel above the stove, its bow catching firelight in the shape of a small wheel. The photograph stood beside the candle in the cracked mug. Miriam Eliza Mallory looked out from 1903 with a tool in her hands and the mill hole behind her, neither smiling nor solemn, only ready. March did not arrive all at once. It loosened things first. Snow withdrew from the shaded bank in gray folds. The lane softened underfoot and took boot prints deeply enough to hold rainwater. Ice vanished from the edges of the creek, and the creek itself grew loud with snowmelt coming down from the ridges, brown-green and muscular, shouldering against stones, filling the raceway until water moved there with an old remembered purpose. Walnut catkins lengthened above the lane. Daffodils near the uphill wall opened in a small yellow crowd, bright against the dark foundation. Ferns pushed tight fists through wet leaves. The McCarter dog, who had spent most of winter barking from the porch, began traveling his fence line again, stiff but committed. Reverend Boyd's shoes gathered red mud instead of dust. Caleb came on Saturdays with his sleeves pushed up and went home with wood chips stuck to his sweatshirt. Doris's sacks changed from winter beans to spring onions, leftover ham, and once a jar of strawberry preserves with the lid marked return. Silas worked differently in spring. Winter had demanded defense. Keep water out. Keep heat in. Keep walls standing. Spring asked what kind of life could enter after defense was done. She cleaned the front room shelves, mended the rear door, oiled hinges, and washed the windows until light came through without the gray film of abandonment. She set the heirloom tools on a high shelf, not displayed for visitors, because there were none, but placed where she could see them from the table. She did not begin the miller's trade that spring. That decision took longer than the work around it. The stones were still uninspected. The wheel remained broken. The raceway needed clearing. The gearing had missing teeth, and the bolter cloth was torn beyond use. More than that, her hands were not ready for the old precision. A letter could grant welcome. It could not grant mastery. Eliza Jane's instructions deserved better than hunger, fear, and a young woman trying to prove she belonged by rushing what would outlast her. So she made a smaller plan. She would spend one coin, only one, and not one of the rarest. She would sell it properly, with record and receipt, and use the money for practice materials, scrap limestone, small marble offcuts, a better sharpening stone, a true mallet, safety glasses, lamp oil, and paper for notes. She would practice on small samples before touching any living part of the mill. Straight lines first, shallow furrows, wheat heads, the wheel mark, letter forms, mistakes made on pieces small enough to forgive. In April, she cleared a corner of the back room for a bench. The window there opened now, and air moved in carrying creek sound, damp earth, and the faint green smell of new leaves. She laid the broken whetstone beside the better one, the old beside the new. She placed Ace's bent nail in a small jar with the glazier's points left over from February. The plumb bob hung from a peg near the door, its brass tip pointing faithfully toward the floor she had repaired. One evening, after rain, She sat at the table while the creek ran full and the walnut branches darkened against the last light. The mill was not saved in any final sense. It still leaned. It still needed more money, more skill, more weather survived. The county still required proof. The wheel still waited in silt. But the room held warmth. The roof held. The walls held. She held. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Silas finished the first piece she did not feel ashamed to wrap. It was not large. A hand-carved stone roundel, no wider than a bread plate, cut from pale Tennessee limestone with a shallow water wheel at the center and wheat bending around the rim. The lines were not machine perfect. They carried the slight human variations of breath, pressure, and correction. But the furrows were clean, the wheel balanced, and the outer edge rubbed smooth with sandpaper, then polished by cloth until it felt softened by years rather than weeks. She completed it during the first cold spell of the month, when frost held in the shaded grass until nearly noon and the creek ran clear over dark stones. The stove was lit. The brass key rested on the mantel. The photograph of Miriam Eliza stood near the candle, its tin surface catching a narrow stripe of winter light. On the workbench lay the tools that had taught her without forgiving clumsiness too quickly, the inherited chisels, the small dresser's pick, the newer mallet bought after selling a single coin, the sharpening stone now worn hollow in the middle from repeated use. Silas did not call the roundel art. She did not call it heritage aloud, though perhaps that word came closest. It was simply the first object in which practice, patience, and memory had stopped arguing. She wrapped it in brown paper saved from Hargett hardware, tied it with cotton string, and wrote one small card in pencil, made at Hollow Branch Mill. Then she set it on the table and let it remain there overnight before deciding whether it was finished. By then, the interior had become a room no longer bracing itself for insult. The floors held a dark honey shine where feet passed most often, deepening toward mahogany near the stove and under the table. The plaster patches near the chimney had dried to a soft lime color and no longer drew the eye unless morning light fell across them from the side. The windows opened and closed with modest effort, their old glass bending the walnut branches into gentle waves. Shelves behind the counter held jars of nails, folded cloth, lamp wicks, pencils, ledger books, and small stone samples labeled by date and lesson learned. The front room still belonged partly to the mill. The stones remained covered except when inspected. The hopper had been braced. The gear pit had a safer rail. One broken pulley hung on the wall, not as decoration, but as a reminder of work not yet ready. The bolter frame waited under a sheet. The wheel outside had not turned again, though silt had been cleared from around its lower rim and 2 missing buckets had been measured for future replacement. The place had moved from ruin to workshop without pretending to be restored beyond truth. The brass key waited almost 2 years before finding its lock. It happened after a hard wind in late November brought down a dead limb from the largest walnut tree. The limb fell without striking the mill, landing instead across the lane, where Caleb, now taller and quieter, helped cut it into firewood. When the branch tore away, it exposed a scar on the trunk above the half-swallowed horseshoe, a long vertical seam hidden for decades beneath bark and moss. Silas saw metal inside it. Not much. Only a greenish edge catching light where wood had split. She waited until the cut limb was cleared, then brought the lantern, the brass key, and the old photograph outside. Rain threatened but did not fall. The horseshoe remained embedded below, its lower curve still visible. Above it, within the newly opened scar, was a small brass plate set deep into the tree's living wood. The plate bore the water wheel mark. Her hand knew before the key entered. The bow matched the mark. The shaft slid into a narrow keyway almost hidden by swollen bark. It resisted at first, then turned with a dry, careful click that seemed too small for the years behind it. A panel no wider than her palm loosened in the trunk, not a door carved into the living heart, but a brass-lined pocket set into an old wound long before the tree grew around it. Inside lay an oilcloth packet. Silas carried it into the mill before opening it. Some things wanted a table, a flame, and dry hands. The packet's outer layer had stiffened but held. Within it was a folded 48-star flag, small, perhaps once carried rather than flown, its cotton browned at the creases but intact. The stars sat in orderly rows, 48 of them, a nation as it had been when the note beneath was written. The note was dated December 2, 1918. To whoever keeps the mill after us. This flag was folded for Thomas Hiram Mallory, who died in France before the bells at home were done ringing. His sister Eliza could not bear to put it in the ground, and I could not bear to leave it in a drawer where moths and bitterness would have equal claim. So we have placed it in the walnut, under the iron shoe, because trees understand keeping better than houses do. If the key has found your hand, then you have stayed long enough to be trusted with what grief could not spend. Take it out into light once a year. Do not let it become a relic only. Cloth is like memory. It must breathe. Miriam Eliza Mallory-Whitaker, Hollow Branch Mill, December 2, 1918. Silas read the note standing beside the table where the first candle had burned. Miriam, the young woman in the photograph, the face that had crossed time with its calm mouth and tool-ready hands. She had written the note during a war year, after bells, after telegram, after loss had entered the mill and found work still waiting in the bins. The flag smelled faintly of oilcloth, dust, and a dry cotton age beyond ordinary laundry. Silas unfolded it only halfway that first day, enough to count the stars, enough to let air move through the fabric, not enough to risk the seams before learning how best to preserve it. Then she folded it again along its existing creases and placed it in an acid-free box ordered after 3 careful conversations with a librarian who knew a museum volunteer in Knoxville. The medal went with her the following Memorial Day. She chose May 30 because the old newspapers in the libraries still called it Decoration Day, and because Thomas Hiram Mallory had belonged to a generation that would have known that name first. She rode with Mrs. Blevins, who had offered the trip without drama, to Knoxville National Cemetery, where rows of white stones held their steady geometry under spring light. The exact grave was not his. Thomas rested overseas, according to the record they found. So Silas stood at the World War Memorial section, held the bronze medal in its open case, and read his name from a copied service card in a voice low enough for only the dead in the nearest grass to hear. She did not leave the medal there. It belonged to the mill, and to the next hand. But she placed a small stone from Walden Creek beneath a cedar tree near the path and set her palm on it once before leaving. That was all. Enough does not always look like much. The money lasted because she treated it as a trust, not a rescue. Over 2 years, she spent only 4 coins. 1 sold for winter survival and proper tools. 1 for roof materials beyond what credit and salvage could cover. 1 for the legal petitions, permits, back taxes, and inspections required to keep the demolition order from returning in another form. 1 for preservation supplies, the acid-free box, safer wiring to the back room, and a modest signboard from a local sawyer who let her pay slowly. Every sale was written down. Date, coin, dealer, amount, use, receipt, balance, The ledger became her answer to temptation. When fear told her to sell more and make herself untouchable, she opened the old account book and read the forgiven names. When pride told her to restore too fast and show the town what she had made of what they had condemned, she closed the tin box and swept the floor instead. The remaining coins were wrapped, listed, sealed, and returned to a hidden place known only to her and, in writing, to whoever might one day need them more. She wrote on the envelope for the next one. The shop reopened without announcement. Doris made it happen by way of a corkboard index card between a notice for piano tuning and a flyer for pasture-raised eggs. The card was cream-colored, written in Silas's careful pencil because she refused printed boldness. Hollow Branch Mill. Hand-carved stone roundels. Repairs taken slowly. Letters answered by mail. Asked Doris. Doris had added the last line herself in blue ink. For the first month, nothing happened except that the card curled slightly from steam and cafe heat. Then a woman from Townsend asked for a small stone marker for her herb garden. A man from Sevierville wanted a house number cut into slate. Mrs. Blevins ordered a wheat and wheel roundel and paid in advance, ignoring Silas's attempt to refuse advance payment. Reverend Boyd asked for a plain river stone carved with 4 words for his wife's grave. God kept us steady. By spring, the mailing list held 43 names written on lined paper and kept in a cigar box behind the counter. Not customers exactly. Neighbors. Interested strangers. People who had seen the cafe card. People who wrote letters by hand. People willing to wait. Silas answered each one at the table by the back window. Some requests she accepted. Some she declined because the stone was wrong, the timeline too hurried, or the purpose too showy for the shop's small strength. No sign on the highway pointed toward the mill. No article came. No camera crew arrived. Tourists did not line the lane. The McCarter dog, older now and nearly white around the face, still barked at delivery trucks and ignored Silas unless she carried biscuits. The county record showed compliance, permits, and conditional preservation status, which was a colder kind of mercy, but mercy nonetheless. Caleb returned with the sign in late June. He came walking down the lane at dusk, no longer on the Schwinn, carrying a board wrapped in an old quilt. He had grown into his wrists and shoulders by then, though his hair still fell forward when he looked down. Hollis followed at a distance, pretending he had only come to inspect the roof after storms. Doris had sent a basket. Reverend Boyd was already at the walnut trees, hat in hand, as if he had known the hour without being told. Caleb set the wrapped board across 2 sawhorses on the porch. "My mother said I should not keep it in the shed any longer," he said. Silas untied the quilt. The sign was cedar, hand-carved, oiled to a warm brown, its edges slightly uneven in a way that made it living rather than careless. Across it, in deep, clean letters, he had carved, "Hollow Branch Mill and Daughters." The ampersand curved like water around stone. Beneath the words was a small wheel with 8 spokes, not copied perfectly from the old mark, but understood. At the lower corner, hardly visible unless a person leaned close, Caleb had carved a chickadee on a walnut branch. Silas did not speak immediately. The plural did not belong to children she had not had, nor to any claim the world would recognize. It belonged backward and forward at once. Eliza Jane. Miriam Eliza. Ruth Anna. Ruth, in her frailty and failed courage. Silas, with soot in her skin and putty under her nails. The next one, unnamed. Daughters of Blood. Craft. Shelter. Error. Repair. Caleb shifted his weight. "If you hate it, I can plane it down." "No," she said. The word came rough. Hollis looked toward the creek. Doris wiped one eye with the corner of a paper napkin and pretended a gnat had troubled her. Reverend Boyd bowed his head without making the moment public property. They hung the sign above the front door with 2 black iron brackets Mr. Hargett had found in a nail keg. Caleb held the ladder. Silas drove the screws. Hollis told her one was high by an 1/8 inch, and she backed it out without argument. When the sign settled level, the porch seemed to stand a little straighter beneath it. That evening, after everyone had gone, Silas lit the old candle again. Not long. Only a few minutes. The flame had burned lower over the years, and she guarded what remained. She set out Eliza Jane's letter, Miriam's note, the copied plat, the coin ledger, and her own notebook. Then she took a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer and sharpened her pencil with the pocket knife that still had a loose blade. She had delayed this task longer than any repair. Writing to the next inheritor required humility of a kind more difficult than accepting help. It required admitting that the mill would one day stand without her, or fall after her, or pass to hands she could not inspect. It required trusting an unknown person with instruction but not control. It required leaving behind not a monument, but permission. She wrote the date first. Then she stopped and listened. The creek outside moved through summer darkness. The wheel, still not turning, held moonlight along its upper rim. In the cellar below, the dressed granite slab remained unmoved at the center of the stone floor, its mark waiting under dust. On the mantel, the brass key lay beside the photograph. The 48 Star flag rested in its box. The coins were sealed and listed. The shop sign, newly hung, creaked once in the cooling air. Silas bent over the page. "My dear one, whoever you are." She looked at the words for a long time. They were not hers. Not entirely. That was why they were right. She continued below them, slowly, telling only what she had earned the right to tell. How to find the shutoff for the new wiring. Which floorboard near the gear pit still deserved caution. Where Hargett's son kept lime after Emmett's knees finally forced him away from the counter. Which coin dealer had treated her fairly. How to oil the window pulleys. How to keep the cotton sash cord from swelling. How not to hurry the stone. How to read the old ledger when fear began making poor suggestions. Near midnight, she stopped. The letter was not finished. It did not need to be finished in one night. Some inheritances were written by installments. Between orders, storms, winters, and the 1,000 ordinary acts by which a place was kept from becoming only memory. She folded the unfinished pages and placed them in a blue folder marked Next. Then she banked the stove, checked the door latch, and stepped outside. The summer air smelled of walnut leaves, creek water, and warm wood. Above the porch, the carved sign rested in shadow, its letters barely visible. The road beyond the trees was empty. No one came demanding proof. No one came offering spectacle. No one came to take back what quiet work had made lawful in the deepest sense. Silas stood with one hand on the porch post and listened to water entering the old race. The grist mill waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, in the bottom drawer beneath recorded deeds and maps no one opened unless paid to, Mrs. Blevins kept a small envelope with a notepaper clipped to its face. Inside lay a worn $5 bill and 2 softened ones, the first payment made for Hollow Branch Mill, retired from circulation by a woman who understood that some records deserved to remain touchable. On the note, in careful green ink, she had written one line. $7, paid in full.